much for coming in for this. I'm going to capture your attention best I can. Good morning. I'm Jane Wales. I'm Vice President of the Aspen Institute for Philanthropy and Society, and I'll say a little word about the context in which we're meeting. But I thought we should perhaps start by just each person giving their name and where they come from very quickly around the room. And then, so we have a quick introduction, and then I'll say a word about this session and turn it over to Ross, who is moderating. Susan.
I'm Susan.
Morning, on the phone here.
I'm sorry? Who's on the phone?
Jim Connell on the phone.
Hi, Jim. Okay.
Susan Scheffler, Executive Director of KIPDC. Sarah Kimball, CAO, KIPDC.
Gary Huggins, Executive Director of the Commission on No Child Left Behind at Aspen.
Paul Kimmelman, Learning Point Associates.
Sarah Alney, Director of Teacher Quality with the Education Trust.
Rebecca Stewart, Director of K-12 Education Programs at the Philanthropy Roundtable.
Claire Durwood, a Policy Associate and Research Analyst at the Consortium on Chicago School Research.
Tony Milnowski from University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Diana Houghton, the Chief Executive Officer for Community Resources for New Leaders Community Schools.
Greg Lansman, Director of Policy and Development for the Strive Partnership in Cincinnati.
Enoch Woodhouse with the Office of Data and Accountability at DC Public Schools.
Michael Rasmussen with the Rodell Foundation of Delaware.
Kelly Wilson, I'm the Director of the Masters in School Leadership Program at the High Tech High Graduate School of Education in
Arthur McKee, City Bridge Foundation here in Washington, D.C.
Rachel Muterman with the Center for Effective Philanthropy.
Ella Moore, Strategic Data Fellow, DC Public Schools.
Todd Hellman, Managing Director, Telford Kids.
Brooke Lopakrona with Denver Public Schools.
Kate Barrett, I'm at the Center for High Impact Philanthropy.
Naomi Hausman, Executive Director for the School District of Philadelphia.
I'm Catherine Brown, Teach for America.
Josh Weisberg, I work with Kate.
I'm Cindy Brown from the Center for American Workers.
Kate Walsh from the National Council on Teacher Quality.
Andrew, the Gates Foundation.
And Ross Weiner from the Aspen Institute.
So what I'm going to do, because we are web streaming this meeting to those who couldn't participate, so I'm going to ask you all to grab a microphone when you speak going forward so that folks know, so folks can hear your comments.
Should we see if anybody else is on?
Is anybody other than Jim on the phone? Okay, thanks.
This is John Price, Intel Corporation.
Hi, thanks for joining us. I'm Jane Wales, and I wanted to say just a quick word of background. The Aspen Philanthropy Group, which is a gathering of chief executives of major foundations throughout the country and a couple from overseas, have identified what they think may be a problem and asked us to help them find the solution. The problem they've identified is the possibility there may be a lack of alignment between grant seekers and grant makers and other stakeholders when it comes to M&E systems. And so what they've asked us to do is gather experts in different issue domains, get a sense from them what M&E systems, what evaluation systems have worked best for them, to take us from the sort of the particular to the example in a given issue domain to the more general, to get a sense of what are the broad principles and practices that we can derive from your experience and ones that can inform particularly new philanthropists going forward. They imagine that the best of all worlds is a world in which data is gathered in a timely way and in such a way and is organized around decision making, so that that data can be can inform decision making. But the second objective, obviously, is continuous learning. And by continuous learning, they're not just speaking about grant makers and grant seekers. They're talking about the field more broadly. So I think the issue there is that there's an assumption, therefore, that there'll be a level of transparency when it comes to data gathered. Transparency both by grant makers and grant seekers. And there's an assumption that there's a deep collaborative approach by grant makers and grant seekers, so that decision points for both have been identified. And so that the data, the very act of gathering the data is not overly burdensome and overly, and can be afforded. And so that's sort of the perfect world they imagine, and they'd love to know whether, in fact, that perfect world can exist in your area of expertise. So we're really lucky that Ross, my colleague here at Aspen Institute, has agreed to moderate this, because he actually is an expert, unlike me, in this issue area. And so I'm going to turn it over to Ross with thanks.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks Jane and the team. Thanks Josh and Tara for putting all this together. It's an amazing group of individuals that we have in the room today and on the phone. There's a lot of knowledge, a lot of talent here. I think one of our challenges is how to leverage all of it to really inform the work of the philanthropists that Jane and her colleagues work with, and how to help them get smarter. So, and we've got sort of measurement and evaluation is on the table in two ways today, because that work, that substantive work of measuring and evaluating effectiveness, productivity in school systems, in schools, is exploding right now. Lots of changes on the policy front, lots of changes out in the field in terms of really ratcheting up and trying to improve this work. And then there's sort of this second order question of measurement and evaluation of that work. How do we know whether we're getting better at measuring and evaluating effectiveness in schools and in school systems? And I think that's where we're going to try and pitch our work today. So part of that discussion may need to get into the substance of what's going on to improve measurement and evaluation in schools and school systems. But the question really is, how do we know? And if philanthropists are increasingly going to be investing in this space and trying to help systems get better at that, how should they be asking the questions? How do they know whether it's really getting better? And how do they do that in a way that, as Jane was saying, helps inform the work in the field, doesn't create a whole new set of measures and evaluations just for the funders, but that actually becomes meaningful information for both funders and for the people on the front lines doing the work. So again, as I said, there's lots going on in this field right now, and so want to start by getting a couple of perspectives, both from funders and from folks doing the work in the field, about what is this work, where is this work going, and what do we need to know whether it's actually getting us the results we want or not. And so I'm hoping to start actually with Steve Cantrell from the Gates Foundation. They've made a huge priority of this work and are pushing both on the substantive systems themselves and on the questions of how we know whether it's working or not. So Steve, will you give us a little bit of an overview of that work?
Maybe we'll take that microphone from thanks.
Yeah, happy to do that. So many of you around the table have been involved in this work in one way or another, or your partners have been, certainly, if you haven't. But we've just embarked. In fact, we've just finished the first year of data collection. So a year ago, we were sitting here, and this was just a theoretical possibility. We thought maybe if we threw a lot of energy behind a big initiative, then we could end up with data at the end of the year. We sat. Tony Milanowski was there in a conference in Chicago in June. And our closest, dearest, most critical friends sat around and told us we were a little bit nuts, but go forth and prosper. We've come to the end of this year, and we've just recorded our 13,000th lesson using an innovative video technology. And it's just, I'm a little bit shocked that it worked, but not more shocked than the folks in the room in Chicago last year. So what we did, that's just a piece of it, but it was actually the most dramatic of the challenges. So this is a long way of saying we believe that measurement has to, if you're going to measure teacher effectiveness, it's got to start in the classroom. And if it's going to start in the classroom, you need to have the kind of data that you believe in and that you trust and that can be verified. And up to this point, classroom observation has been marginal at best in its ability to inform policymakers. And in part, it's because it's so darn hard to collect and verify. Even to get inter-rater reliability, and this is just to find agreement, you need to have more than one observer in a single classroom, and then you multiply that over multiple instances if you want precision at the teacher level. So huge challenge there. If you want, and that's just for reliability. If you're trying to get these folks tuned to some kind of true score, then that's a whole nother apparatus that you have to build. So video solves a lot of these challenges and has the benefit of being a persistent asset, which means that we can go back as our tools get better and reanalyze this data without troubling school systems again. So we're pretty excited to have this. But this video collection is just part of a larger measure, multiple measures. In fact, that's part of what we're trying to prove, is that having simply value added may be enough for prediction. We don't know, because forecasting is important. You know, school systems want to know what the likelihood of performance will be for a given teacher. And so, you know, the forecasting, I don't want to take anything away from that, but we all realize that a value-added measure alone, what might be useful for forecasting, isn't very good for helping a teacher get better. It basically conveys this information, jump higher if you've got a low score, or pat yourself on the back if you've got a high score. But you're not sure why or what kinds of things might help you improve. And so there's two aspects to the multiple measures. One, we're looking at a range of things. So student feedback on the teacher's instructional environment. So we're asking kids, you know, college teachers do it all the time. Not so common in school systems. It happens, but it's not super common. We're asking teachers, what do they know about the task of teaching? So building on Deb Ball's work, different from content knowledge. You know, we believe content knowledge is important up to a point, but at a certain level of math, taking that next advanced math course isn't necessarily going to be, you're not going to get returns that you're going to see in your own student's performance. Perhaps, not proven, but just an inkling of ours, and Deb Ball's. And so we're actually working to measure what are the kinds of things that a teacher should know if they're going to be teaching in secondary school. We're primarily in secondary schools with some 4th and 5th. And then finally, we're looking at a couple different types of value add on 2 different types of tests. So we've got the state tests, and then we've got these, what we're calling supplemental assessments. And these are more like what will be generated by these collaboratives that will win this contest soon. And so we're putting all this information together, and we're building a composite. And so one part of this is trying to figure out, can we get better about forecasting future performance? But the second part, as I alluded to before, is is there information here that's just as useful for the teacher as it is for the system, and just as useful for the system as it is for the funder? And I'll end there.
Great.
Enough of an overview?
I hope so. I bet there's we have questions and comments to follow up on that. Wanted also to turn, before we sort of open it up and try and get some others to jump in, to Claire from the Chicago perspective. They've recently done some work around teacher evaluations in Chicago, and curious how you came into that project. What did Chicago want to know? And where's that work going? I think it's sort of still at the beginning stages. So just give us a sense of what you found and what you're still looking for.
Sure. So I am one of several researchers on the research team. I joined the team at the beginning of last school year. Sarah Stolinga and Lauren Sartain and Eric Brown are the 3 others that lead the effort. And so this pilot began in 2008-2009 school year with 44 elementary schools in Chicago Public Schools. After the district and union leadership had finished a collaborative process, they decided to use the Charlotte Danielson framework as the basis of this evaluation pilot. And so our role at the consortium has been to really answer 2 research questions. First, is this tool fair? We're looking at fairness from both a validity perspective, where we want to understand what measures of teaching, in fact, correspond with student learning measures. We've yet to release any of that, though, yet. And but then also looking at questions of reliability. So as Steve Cantrell talked about, inter-rater reliability. Can two people walk into a classroom and rate the lesson in the same way without discussing what happened? And so we've now completed the second year of the pilot so far, which is now scaled up to just over 100 elementary schools in Chicago. And over the course of this past year, where I was involved, we were able to have unprecedented access to actually sit and observe a principal meeting with his or her teachers to do a pre-conference, a classroom observation, a post-observation conference as well. So that's going to be forthcoming, our analysis of those observations. What we've learned so far, though, first is that the Danielson framework does appear to be a fair and reliable tool when it comes to identifying low-performing teachers. So what that means is people can consistently identify teachers who are unsatisfactory. Unsatisfactory, according to Danielson, is defined as causing harm to students. So the bar is set quite low when it comes to what unsatisfactory practice means. The other findings are a little more of a mixed bag. The second finding is that we recognize that there are certain aspects of teaching that are first difficult to measure and also difficult for teachers to master. One such component is engaging students in learning. This is considered to be the heart of the Danielson framework and truly the point of teaching. And so what our research shows is that given the difficulties in rating at how well a teacher can engage his or her students with learning, there are implications for how that would factor into how that evaluation data how those evaluation data are used for summative or formative purposes. A third finding is that principals had a tendency to assign higher ratings to some of their teachers more often than in comparison with external observers. The data on this are that principals assigned a distinguished rating, which is the highest on a 4-point rating scale, to their teachers 12% of the time in comparison to external observers, which was 7% of the time. So we want to understand, well, why is that? We've talked with principals to get a better understanding of the school culture factors, learning climate factors, perhaps even external factors that may weigh in. But that also speaks to how subjectivity can enter in the evaluation process. And finally, the early indications from our second year pilots, the second year of our study show that, or are leaning to show that there are some principals who have lower engagement with the process. Overall, what we found is that more than half of principals have high enthusiasm towards this evaluation process and the framework. But for those who don't have as high enthusiasm, we think that there could be implications for how well this could scale up across the district, because they may lack the instructional leadership capacity to truly enact this process effectively. So those are some of our biggest findings as of yet, and we are now in analysis mode for the summer to release more results later this fall and winter.
Great, thanks. So there may be some questions for Steve and Claire, but also want to sort of draw out some other perspectives on, if we think about data for continuous improvement as well as data for sort of program evaluation, how do we know whether it's working? Where are we in the field right now? Do we have the information that we need? And I guess the complement to that is, what, in terms of the capacity to understand and use and act on that data, sort of where are we on that? And with regard to both of those, where have investments from philanthropy made a big difference, and where are there areas where either the investments haven't been effective, or where there's actually a lot of space that hasn't been covered yet? So again, if you have questions that you want to follow up or clarify what Steve or Claire said, or if you have comments about just this sort of larger topic, would invite people at this point.
This is Jim Powell. I can make a comment on that.
Sure.
I could just share very briefly that the Gates Foundation has funded us over the past 4 or 5 years to develop
classroom observation assessment, where we've actually been working with these assessments embedded within our reform work with the First Things First framework. So these are schools that are committed to reform change, and part of that change is to begin looking objectively at the quality of classroom practice. And over about, I think we're up to about 18 or 19,000 observations in about 40 or 50 schools, that the human side of this work, that is the data infrastructure side, which we've just been talking about in terms of, that Steve's been talking about, the Gates work now on trying to get effective instruments to measure the quality of teaching, including classroom observation. The other side of this is the human side, Josh, which I think you just mentioned, which is how do you get folks to actually use these data to make a difference in terms of their practice. And I think it's very clear that if we're going to measure the effectiveness of evaluation techniques, we have to kind of measure both sides of this, which is we have some schools that we consider the instruments that we've developed to be quite useful in the sense of accurate, valid, and reliable. We have now an IES study of the validity of our instrument underway. But there's tremendous variation in what my colleague from Chicago was talking about, the will and the understanding of how to use these data to actually impact what's going on in classrooms and ultimately student outcomes. And we've been working very hard on developing protocols and structures and processes for introducing data into the system and eventually making it a culture that both accepts people in classrooms but also makes it their business to take a look at those data in real time in relation to student learning. And I just can't emphasize this any more strongly, is that as much variation as you might have in the sophistication and quality of instruments and the access of teachers to those data and to administrators to those data, you have equal or greater variation on the other side, which is the willingness and the capacity and the sustainability of people using those data in ways that actually shape practice more than traditional programmatic kind of initiatives moving practice around or trying to move practice around. And we do have some evidence now that we don't know whether the data itself was the necessary and sufficient condition in the use of it, but we do have high associations between the use of the data, the quality of the data, and seeing some advances in student performance associated with that. But we do not have a separate study of whether that alone or whether it's just that embedded with the other reform strategies that are making a difference.
Great. That's a very helpful comment. So I'm going to turn to Kate Walsh in just a second, but actually want to just tee up on our colleagues from KIPP and also Jerry Weeks from Montgomery County, who just joined us, to think about that comment that was just put in and get ready to share with us some reflections on sort of what are the technical barriers to getting quality in this work around evaluation of performance, and the cultural, practical barriers to how do you actually make it meaningful in schools. But Kate, I know you wanted to jump in as well.
Well, I actually found the last comment to be much more interesting than put us on a track that was much more interesting than what I had to contribute. I was just wanted to follow up with on the question of engaging students in learning, and I'd like to hear from both Steve and Claire about a little bit more about that feature of it and what you've done to address it. I know Gates has been, very much on those particular areas of things that are particularly hard to measure. So I would just like to hear a more complete response to that very important nugget. How do you assess whether children are engaged in learning? But then I don't want to divert us too much from the previous comment. I'd like to.
So I think that'll be great actually to get that on the table. It gives also our colleagues just a second to collect their thoughts too. So Steve and Claire.
Sure. I can jump in really quickly and first just say that, my team and I, we're not in the position where we're the ones deciding now how to fix this issue. We're just trying to help understand what may be causing it so we can hand that over to the district so that they can make that decision. But when it comes to engaging students in learning, one thing that we're doing to better understand why this is hard to measure is we're doing an analysis of the actual observational statements that principals wrote down and entered in and said, this is what I observed this teacher do that demonstrates how he or she was engaging students in learning. So literally, they sit there and script, in theory, what they saw the teacher do, and then they enter that into a system called DS2, and then I'm now looking at all the things they wrote, and something that is emerging is that it looks as though the quality of what they wrote down is low, meaning they wrote down very little, or it's difficult to follow what it is that was happening. And so there's a number of possibilities for what that could mean, but it's at least showing that just sitting and observing your teacher to understand how well they engage students may not be sufficient to accurately capture what that, to actually measure that.
So
that's helpful.
You don't know that the principal knows to observe whether all children in the class are being involved in the discussion or lecture or whatever is going on. That's not something that's not part of the observational rubric.
It is. So the Danielson framework, I don't want to get too technical either, but so the Danielson framework has 4 domains. We are only looking at 2 of those domains because those are the ones that can actually be observed and seen. Within those 2 domains are 5 components, and so engaging students with learning is part of the classroom observation domain, and there are other components that all support engaging students with learning. So questioning and discussion techniques, how well you're pacing the lesson. Those are 2 examples. So my hypothesis was that perhaps principals could see those things, but they just couldn't understand that seeing kids, paying attention isn't all that goes into engaging them in learning, right? There's more to it than that. And so I thought perhaps they were confusing their questioning and discussion techniques with engaging students with learning, but that doesn't seem to be the case. There's something else going on. We don't know exactly what just yet.
Yeah. So I could imagine having engaging students in learning on a checklist and having that box not be very helpful. And especially when you tell a teacher you gotta better engage your students because it just begs definition, right? So we are using a set of frameworks to look at all these videos that I had mentioned earlier. In fact, we're using 5 different frameworks, and in some ways they're competing theories of action for instruction, and the ways they get at engagement are different. So we're using Pianta's class, we're using Danielson. Those are our 2 general frameworks. Then we're using 3 subject-specific frameworks. One developed for mathematics by Heather Hill, Mathematical Quality of Instruction. Plato is in English Language Arts, developed by Pam Grossman. And then for science, Ray Pachon is developing a new instrument. He's previously developed California's PACT and Connecticut's BEST. But so these we'll figure out a little bit more about which aspects of engagement, to the extent they're measuring it, are useful. And then we've got a couple other windows inside this engagement question, but one is just asking the students. So we're asking their feedback. Are you engaged? Are you enjoying this? And we ask it in a number of ways. But you could imagine that if a teacher did this routinely, that they would then tweak some things and ask their students again and see if those things worked or not. And so it's less prescriptive in terms of how to engage, but it could be a process for figuring it out with your particular group of students. And then finally, this whole knowledge of teaching or knowledge for teaching assessment gets at engagement too, but in different ways than we're typically thinking about, I think anyways. Diagnosing misperception is a way of engaging. You're meeting a student where they're at and how they're engaging with the material, and you're figuring out how is it that your incorrect thought can be transformed into right thinking about this discipline. But we also are asking teachers, can you recognize lots of different right ways to a solution? And so if a student is thinking correctly about a problem and the teacher doesn't recognize that the student is thinking correctly about the problem, that's very disengaging. If you tried to correct somebody who's correct, my first thought is they're a fool. And if students are thinking their teachers are foolish, they're disengaged. And so really trying to increase the craft knowledge to prevent that kind of misunderstanding between student and teacher, and therefore increase the engagement.
Thanks, and I think one of the really interesting things about the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching project is this idea of student feedback, student voice, getting into this. I think education has been struggling. Sort of, how do you, try and get some of the 360 evaluations that have, sort of made a bigger difference in performance management, potentially in other sectors, and sort of figuring out how to capture that student voice and also teacher voice about what's going on in their schools. Just seems like a really interesting part of all this. So if folks have know of other places where that's starting to push into the education space or ideas on that, I think it'd be an interesting thing to explore. But
can I just say one thing about the engagement question? That's okay?
Sure.
In the instrument that we've developed, the classroom visit protocol, and here's where it kind of departs from the video has tremendous advantage in terms of its preservability, et cetera, but one of the things that we actually have talked about some of the folks with the folks who are doing the GATE study, our measure of classroom engagement of students actually involves the students in real time, so that the observer is in the classroom, randomly selects 5 students, does a visual observation very quickly of whether it appears as if they are actually doing the work that they're supposed to be doing in the class. That's a measure of compliance, not engagement. And then picks 3 of those kids to go and ask a couple very pointed questions about their understanding of the work and their experience of interest in the work, so that we actually get data from the students in real time during those classroom observations to combine with the sort of more objective, video-capable observation that anyone can do, and just sort of looking at the student behavior. So the focus is not primarily even on the teacher to ask the question about engagement of students, but the focus is really the star reporter of student engagement for students, which is what they're doing and what they're saying about what they're doing. So the surveys will get some of that, but that of course will be some kind of aggregate measure rather than in actual real time. But the actual querying of students in real time with very pointed, targeted questions can actually reveal quite a bit. And the initial data from the IES study of our instrument is indicating that the engagement variation is actually the most predictive of gains in student learning. So that reinforces the Danielson hypothesis as well.
Great, thanks. So want to turn it over to the folks. Let's have, actually, if it's okay, the folks from KIP kick us off, and then we'll go to Montgomery County.
Great. Well, I'm just really excited to see so many people sitting around the table talking about teacher quality and how to measure and evaluate, because having done this for as long as we have, teachers are the most important indicator for our children's success, and so I think it's just phenomenal that we're finally getting to the point of talking about it. We're thrilled to see the GATES results. I'm just giddy to see preliminary stuff and see what you guys come up with next year, because I think that the way they've designed the value add, the student feedback, and the teacher observations, which is really cool. If you haven't seen the tool that they use to see like 360 degrees in a classroom, it's amazing. So we're really excited to see their results, because we're really interested in a wide variety of what these type of evaluations will tell us, because our friends from Chicago said that one of the preliminary results is that the Charlotte Danielson framework is really good at identifying low-performing teachers, but for a network of charter schools who is bringing in and training their own teachers, and we had the flexibility to hire and fire teachers, that's not as big of an issue for us. What we really want to focus on is making sure that when we're training new teachers, that they're becoming as good as they can, as good as they possibly can be, the quickest, and then also taking our good teachers to great. And so also Steve mentioned the sort of subtleties of all of these things, like student engagement, or even identifying student misconceptions. These are all really finite tools that teachers use. And so we're hoping that the frameworks that the data that the GATES come up with is that there's some frameworks that will help us in all these different ways we want to evaluate and train teachers. A couple, the question you asked was, what are some barriers to using sort of measurement and evaluation system for teachers? One is sort of technical. Like, schools need data systems. They need people that are trained in data to collect, to analyze and share. They also need training time for principals and teachers. And then the other thing is the ability to affect the culture, so that this can be wrapped into the schools is sort of the second part. And I think that how the philanthropic community can help with this is providing the funding and the technical expertise to have these data systems available and the training to use them. In terms of the culture, That's not as hard in some places, and from what we've seen, I'd love to hear Chicago talk about this, but like the more teachers know about their craft, the more they're excited about it. And I really found that, you know, the more student achievement data they have, the more they want to see. The more that given their feedback about their own craft, the more they want to learn. And so when we can start breaking it down to small discrete things about what they do that will help them learn better, I think that they're really going to crave it. So I think that the culture thing is actually not the huge hurdle. I think it's more the technical aspects that we have to overcome.
And just a quick follow-up, what do you use right now in KIP DC, around helping teachers to understand their performance and improve? So how much do you use DC CAS scores, sort of the statewide achievement test here, and what other information do you actually put into the system?
We're working right now on a KIP DC model that is actually going to be tied into a KIP national model. I was just on a phone call yesterday, working out this sort of new competency model for teacher excellence. And so we have a model right now. It's a working draft. We do formal evaluations. We look at test score data. But because we're a small system, we also can use a lot smaller inputs. So, you know, when you go do an observation of a teacher, you can also look at their exit slips to see how engaged the students were and how much they mastered the material. And as our colleague on the phone was talking about, the ability to ask students questions during the observation. So because we're on such a small level, we can do a lot more sort of finite digging in when we go do observations of teachers. But we have a competency model. We use student data to talk to teachers about their effectiveness, formal and informal evaluations. And we also do peer-to-peer observations and feedback, which we don't use for any evaluative purposes, but we do use for professional growth. And then we do use a student measure. The KIP Foundation has sponsored a Healthy Schools initiative where there's a parent survey and a student survey that is based off the Gallup student survey of 10 questions that really are highly correlated to success in college. And so we ask our students those questions and use that data as well with our teachers.
And just because I heard the question over here, just say very briefly, what's an exit slip?
It's a little mini way to assess the skill of the day, and so it could be like a 3-question little ticket that you give as the students leave the classroom, and so you can collect them at the end of the day to see which students have mastered, have not mastered that mini skill of the day.
So it's exactly what he was suggesting doing, but doing it, the teachers doing it.
Yep.
So Jerry, I know Montgomery County has done a lot around their teacher evaluation, support, growth system. So if you could talk a little bit about what information you feed into that system, what do you need to support that sort of from a technical side, and also what it's meant to move that system really into the culture of the schools in Montgomery County.
Well, I too, like my colleagues, want to thank the Gates Foundation and the Aspen Foundation for hosting this. I think it's great. It's good to see the KIP schools and everybody else here. I'm sorry I was late. We have a couple things we're doing right now. It's the first day of the new year that we're trying to get off on. There's kind of 2 ways, and I've, kind of new at this, 42 years. And we've been trying to figure out how to make teachers more effective for the last at least that long, and how to judge effectiveness, and then how to judge teacher quality. And sometimes it's been tell, and sometimes it's been sell. And when we started our reform effort in '99 in Montgomery County, we listened before we started to observe. And one of the things that we did in our really environmental scan is that we found out that we had a lot of people leaving. And we found that that was common all over the country. So one of the problems that we thought about having to solve was, what's wrong with the culture where half the docs are walking out of the hospital within 5 years? Another thing we kind of set about in listening is, what causes students not to be prepared? Because you got 2/3 of the country where the kids are not prepared to go to college. So we're maybe only getting still a third out, and then we looked at 40 years of college graduation rates, and we found out they were about the same as they were 40 years ago, about 30%, less than 30%. So that became the 2 problems. Workforce excellence became a high leverage point, and that's what you're talking about in the answer of those problems. here's what they told us, is the culture right now is way too open to reacting to everything. Otherwise, a lot of things are introduced into the culture of school almost on a yearly basis, and they're incentivized to come in from the outside. And that reactive culture causes them not to have a focus about what their job is or how to deal with their job, because those things are generally introduced without a whole lot of training to them. They also told us that there were 3 general areas that we need to figure out solutions to. One of them is the teaching and learning area, like how to pace your instruction, things like you were talking about. You know, how to introduce it, how to make it clear, how to make it compelling. Another one was just the whole area of content expertise. There was varying abilities to actually deal with content. If you want algebra by the 8th grade, it starts in kindergarten. And they had a lot of discussion about most elementary teachers are taught to teach math to elementary kids, 3 hours, college preparation. So how are we going to overcome that? That's a content issue, for example. And then the whole issue of curriculum, it is cloudy as it has been introduced by all of these different facets. There was no common language. When we would say something that would have a concept like achievement, it would be like me saying dog to all of you and you getting an idea of what a dog looks like. They would all be dogs, but you might have a Schnauzer and you might have a Doberman and you might have a Labrador and yours might be a Golden Retriever. So there was a lack of a common language. The feedback loops, they told us, were not enough, didn't drive instruction, wobbly at best, because they lacked clarity in any given area to actually cause them to change anything. The targets were not clear or compelling outcomes for them or the teachers. They didn't get excited about doing state testing. They didn't get excited about national testing. They got excited about getting a child prepared to go to the next level, college and career. So could you make those outcomes clearer? And then a big issue was a whole set of what I call fears. Fears around the lack of clarity, fears around lack of scalability, fears around lack of training, fears on how it would be executed, fears about the wobbly feedback, fears about lack of data systems so they couldn't really handle it. And then there was this thing that they introduced that I thought was pretty novel at the time, but now I actually have bought into it. If we all witnessed a car accident, would we see it the same way? And they brought to us a lot of observations that are dismissed in court because witnesses are notoriously unreliable. So the whole business of how do you observe things is in the eyes of the observer. And how do you train for that? So basically what we tried to do is put a system together to answer all those things. And words make a difference to them. So it wasn't evaluation, it was professional growth. It was trying to give them a common language. So we give them a lot of training on a common language. Right, wrong, it's what MCPS speaks. And everybody that's introduced gets the concepts. Clarity to the target. We chose college and career readiness, mapped everything back down. So that became skills that everybody agreed to. The kids wanted them, the parents wanted them, the teachers wanted to deliver them. The whole way that we changed our hiring and onboarding. We started really looking at KIP and Teach for America and looked at the attitudinal kinds of issues, because there is an attitude of change and you're going to have a lot of that. Then we looked a lot more about their content knowledge rather than beat them up. How do we support that? And then we clarified our curriculum. And then we built a data system that works for them, the kid, and the parent, where they all get feedback electronically, handhelds or different kinds of devices. When we got down to the next level, it was they needed honest support. So we had to embed a lot of staff development right in their buildings. So each of our buildings, for example, the elementary has a staff developer who has no administrative duty, is not involved in evaluation, but is helping teachers with their difficult concepts. Then there had to be a series of roving coaches, like math coaches, to teach teachers how to teach math. The whole idea of how you schedule had to be changed, so there had to be more chances for communication. We then put on experts who were consulting teachers, so there was more than one observer. The principal was the observer, there was a consulting teacher observer. Those were agreed upon with us in the union. So that observer could come in 35 times and not get harassment charges, you know. So you were observing around more clear targets, better feedback. We had to develop our own system of feedback, a quicker data system around a goal that they wanted to observe, and we were trying to change our attitude, not to prove them wrong, but how to fill those gaps where they lacked it in content or teaching and learning or curriculum. From that, we developed really multiple measures. You know, that we're just relying, about a third of it is relying upon hard measures like testing that you would find, but a bunch of other multiple measures.
So actually, before we transition, actually want to get you to speak just to those multiple measures. So if a third is those test score data, the hard data, talk about what fills in the rest of that 2/3, really, if you could. Walk us through, and whether it's the same for teachers in different grades and subjects, or whether there's distinctions.
No, there's complete distinctions, because what we learned is the teacher is a learner too. And you have to differentiate the instruction and tailor based on what they need to know and be able to do, just like you do a child. And that you are really actually creating a learning community where you're trying to cross-pollinate, and the problem you're trying to solve is variability between the best and the least able. And so what you're trying to do is fill that gap, and you fill that gap by increasing your communications, increasing your ability for that cross-pollination to occur, giving it the support to occur, giving it the training to occur, and differentiating it like you do your instruction. See, one of, I think, the challenges that we have is that we actually have a culture that is based on sorting, both teachers and kids. And that culture isn't working too well for either of the teacher or kid. So we tried to create a whole new culture that is one of, we're here to support you, give you clarity, find out the issues, help you learn from each other and observe, and we will have to have achievement outcomes. And so some of that has to be weighed into it. But how you weigh it into it and how you go about in the multiple measures is that. It's hard for me to reduce 35 pages that I can give you about, you know, it's a very comprehensive program. What's really interesting is over the decade that we've had it, we've actually improved teacher retention and teacher exit at the same time, along with the student outcomes. So, you know, I think probably the fact that we listen and let them design probably would be the one thing I would throw out as an idea that you might consider.
So Jerry, you just said something really interesting. The problem you're trying to solve is variability between the most and the least able teacher.
Yeah.
Who owns that problem?
We all do.
Okay, to what extent are principals accountable for that in your system?
They're part of the ownership of the problem, but they're not totally accountable. You see, you've only got one principal, and some of them are running buildings of 1,000 to 3,000 kids, maybe 500. And they're getting calls all the time, day and night. So one of the fears of the teacher is lack of observational time, or interrupted observational time, or lack of clarity of those kind of things. You have to solve that problem. So not only we have multiple measures, we have multiple observers. And it is a series of observations coming from all of these that paint a composite picture of what the teacher needs. And once the teacher understands that, we found that about 70% of them respond very very helpful. And if they can get their answers from somebody that is in their building, we found that that works well. And then networking all those buildings together.
So Paul, I'm going to let you make a quick comment on this, and then I'm actually going to want to transition us. So if the folks who are representing funders or foundations in the room could think a little bit about what their investments in the infrastructure of these systems has been, want to get a couple of comments around that on the table. Paul?
Just a couple quick points. It's good to follow.
Move the microphone over to
A couple quick points. It's good to follow Jerry. I remember working when he was doing a great job in North Carolina in his school district as well, and having worked with Steve. I just want to, half my career was spent as a superintendent or assistant superintendent, and so I like to sometimes land the plane so we're on the runway for a few minutes and set a context. And a couple things is asking the right question about why are we going to do this evaluation, because you can have a file full of evaluations, but the real key is the improving of teacher practice and building this cohort of teachers that can be effective. You know, I'll just say that the reality of education, sometimes the train doesn't move too quickly. I was a principal 40 years ago using videotape self-evaluation with teachers. So it's not, we're not talking about anything new here. And I remember serving on the Glenn Commission in 1957. Life magazine was 40 years later, was still calling, we were calling for the same things that was in that magazine. And the Tim's video was really an aha moment 10 years ago, when all that video from around the world in the teaching of mathematics and science. And so we're still struggling with these concepts, so that the realities of what we need to do are there. In a book I just finished, Congressman Miller, Chairman Miller said, and we have to keep this in mind, we're in analog schools with digital students. So the questions we're asking and the work we're doing might respond to the needs of today, but are we focusing on the realities of tomorrow? What will the classroom of the future look like 5 years from now? And will this process that we're funding and trying to get answers to even be relevant? I know at the organization where I work, my colleagues, I'm not directly involved, but in Learning Point Associates and the Teacher Quality Center, they're working with some states and districts on doing exactly what Jerry said, and that is engaging the stakeholders in the discussions of these multiple measures to build systems that work. The reality of what we have to deal with today is that if we put all the money that's available and help Jerry make Montgomery County the most effective teacher evaluation system in America and prove it works with 100% assurance with every teacher, the reality of the approximately 15,000 other school districts in the nation is that will they in fact embrace this? So a lot of what we're talking about today is embedded in how are we going to develop sort of a centralized preparation system for teachers as well. You know, medical doctors, every profession that wants to get better uses video. Sports, you do more video in sports and plays in schools than you do in teacher evaluation. So the idea is, how do you build a real practice, a knowledge for your practices, I think, that prepare people so that we're all focusing on the key points.
Great, thanks. That was a great wrap up. And I thought particularly interesting your comment about we have analog methods and schools for students who are growing up in a digital age and thinking about what does it look like to understand effectiveness for students who are growing up in this digital media-rich environment, which is so different than many of the schools that they're going to right now. And what's that transition going to look like? Just seem like issues that are perhaps still on the horizon, but ought to be coming quickly. I want to try and transition us into talking about what are the investments that have been made so far in terms of trying to understand the link between student performance and teacher effectiveness. What are the investments that have been made either in infrastructure or in programmatic or cultural change? And so want to invite folks who are either from foundations or represent that world to talk a little bit about if they could characterize what some of those bets have been. We heard a little bit from Steve at the Gates Foundation, and only about one particular part of it. The Gates Foundation has a much larger portfolio in this space. And so, Steve, if you want to characterize that, I would welcome you. But want to get some others, and then also, want to get Brad and potentially Gary talking a little bit about the federal investments in this space. Anybody want to jump in from the funder foundation community? Come back. Sure, go ahead, Lydia. Well, why don't you actually get a microphone, and in the meantime, go over. Art.
Thanks. Just been thinking about this issue, hearing these great folks that you've assembled here at Aspen, and I tend to think that all but a few foundations, such as the Gates Foundation, are really, if they're investing at all in this work, they're investing at what I might call the managerial track level. That is to say, it's not up to a foundation of our size, unfortunately, to say, well, we're going to have a multi-state, thousands of video observations, randomized field tests, all that's not something that's really feasible for a foundation of our size. But what is possible is for us, on occasion, to sit in and say, well, are there any good bets? For example, if in Montgomery County, 10 years ago, Dr. Weiss said, well, we're thinking of going about this way in terms of teacher evaluation. We, as a foundation, could say, well, there's some evidence that suggests that from the research that people, Steve, are doing at that time, that this sounds like a good bet. So we'll help you go about doing that. I will say that the managerial track, which answers questions largely around how to go about doing this, it does not answer the questions, more fundamental questions of what it is you're supposed to be doing and why it might be working. Those fundamental questions are extremely important. The research I'm hoping that Gates is funding and others across the country are funding is important, but I would just say we can't wait for it. In fact, we're not waiting for it. The job, therefore, I see for foundations is to really sort of be honest about looking at whatever the state of the research is, the research that Gates and others are funding, and then using that to inform funding decisions at the managerial level, at least for foundations of our size. I just want to touch on one point that was raised by Paul and I think a little bit by Jerry as well, which is the question of why it is we're even having this conversation. In some ways, especially if you look over the research program of the Gates Foundation or the research program of the Chicago Consortium, I would say that in some ways the state of research on teacher effectiveness is way ahead of the state of research on, let's say, effectiveness of lawyers. And we don't have a national conversation, generally speaking. We have jokes. We don't have national conversation about the effectiveness of lawyers. And you might say, well, that's a very good reason for that. You know, kids are the most important resource. You could go on and on about how the stakes of education are much greater than in the legal world. But I would say, and I think it gets back to Paul's point, it's not a question so much of the stakes, because there's stakes in every profession. It's a question of the institutional arrangements and the culture in which education is finding itself now. We can't simply wave a magic wand and say, well, we're going to come up with some much more flexible managerial system. As Tim Geithner likes to say at the Department of Treasury, a plan beats no plan. A lot of the work that we're doing is really the counter to the institutional arrangements around labor and judging and evaluating teachers that have grown up with unions, collective bargaining agreements, and without them around the country. We're doing this, I would argue, we're doing this because we can't just say, well, we know that's all wrong and we just want to return to the world of principal discretion. We need to come up with a much better system. But we have to keep, I would say we have to keep that in mind. It's very important to do this research. I think it's valuable. But if we allow the research, the imperatives of doing great research, to get in the way of ultimately what is a human process, of asking everyone to be using measurements that are perfectly valid and reliable all the time, which is possible in studies, it is not possible in the real world. Then we're actually going to create things which are we're actually going to create obstacles to seeing things across the country that we might see in places like Montgomery County or in systems such as KIPP.
So I think that's a great comment, and I do think one of the challenges we're facing in the field is that when you look at both other sectors, like you were talking about law and also education systems in other higher performing countries, you see a sort of culture of kind of the exercise of professional judgment that, in a sense, we're trying to figure out how we build in our space and how we get the right tension between the tools and the structures and the measures that tell us whether or not that's happening versus actually trying to build that, and where the tools and structures sometimes actually could be trying to do a workaround for ever getting to the professional judgment, or whether we push that back, I just think is a really interesting thing to explore. Lydia from the Broad Foundation.
Sure, and you know, my slight disclaimer is that I've been at Broad now just not quite 2 months, but our theory of action around this has less been investing in how to create the system, but investing in the people who have done it and getting them to train the next generation of superintendents who will be impacting the large urban districts. So Dr. Wiest, who is one of the Broad Prize finalists this year, will be, we hope, you know, on the road talking about the wonderful things that he's done, working with our Broad residents and the Broad Superintendent's Academy, and trying to spread his learnings about how this works, having done it for a decade and looking at, you know, at other districts like Gwinnett in Georgia, where the culture is there of continuous improvement, and looking at, you know, how teacher performance impacts student learning, and what is it that needs to happen in the school and across the district in order to create and sustain that culture. So rather than us investing directly in the research or in the process, it's in the people who have done it successfully, and then trying to get them to actually be exposed to those who need it and encourage other districts to adopt it. I think we are still in a process of seeing that happen. I can tell you for sure not nearly as quickly as Mr. Broad would like to have it happen, because if it had been as quickly, you know, we would be on to something else entirely. But the investment from our perspective is in the leaders who have been able to make it happen, but it is back to, can you document it, is it happening? And when we are investing in districts, we are collecting, I mean, the dashboards that I have been plowing through of the minutia, and I know that you've had to provide those, so of what the classroom level data is and exactly what happens, and interviewing everyone from the parents, the teachers, the external partners, what their role is in the performance of teachers and students and learning and student performance and achievement data, is something that we examine. We actually have a research and evaluation department that does nothing but collect and examine that data, but we're again not driving the process. We're trying to figure out, are our investments in these districts and in those areas actually working?
And so I want to see if there's any other perspectives from that community, but just want to tee up a question. If you have any perspective, having just gotten there, you know, not into that long, having now plowing through these data dashboards, are there any measures that seem particularly interesting or compelling that you hadn't been focused on previously, or, you know, because you did just come to the Broad Foundation, but you've been working on this education work and improvement for a while. So just curious if anything struck you about what they collect, or does it just seem like lots and lots of numbers?
No, I mean, it's more than we do look at culture and the pervasiveness of the culture. In addition to the hard data, are students moving in all of the subgroups, the English language learners, the minority students, the socioeconomic groups, by grade, by tested subject, you know. So the data that is collected, particularly for the prize, is a binder that's about like this for each of the districts. And the extent to which the culture across the school and with all groups, who is considered an instructional leader, and whether or not that belief that everyone in the system is actually an instructional leader, to the extent that that impacts student learning, is something I would not have expected to be a consistent theme across all the highest performing districts, but it absolutely is, and it's something that we look at, and you know, that gets outside of the classroom. It includes the classroom, but it gets to, you know, all of the parents, all of the partners, all of the assistant soups, area soups, you name it. I would say, for me, the extent to which the broader culture is supporting student achievement and not just the teacher and the student has been interesting to look at. And I don't know if Dr. Wiest has a...
You're right on target. And it's all of our roles. And the more systemic you can make that role, the more you get a culture of teaching and learning. If it becomes one person's job to do the evaluation rather than all of ours, or one person's job to do the teaching rather than all of ours, you get a very analog system. You want a digital system, it all becomes our job. So there has to be clarity in what we want to accomplish. There has to be some common language and some data to support that common language. Feedback loops have to be there. you have to have risks being taken, so you have to create this continuous improvement. You have to be systemic and start to examine problems that you're trying to solve for who to do what, rather than tell and sell and here's the magic bullet. So it becomes less program-driven and more people-driven, and the problem you're trying to solve is this sorting culture. You're trying to make it a culture work for everybody, both student and teacher and parent.
And the final thing I would say is each of the districts that I've had a chance to get through some of the data for the finalists this year for the prize have a very specific structure in place where teachers are expected to not only perform but improve and have the professional development to support them and a clear understanding of where they're expected to go and who they go to get the support, and understanding that if they don't improve, they get out. And so that culture, having the structure to support the teaching and learning, in addition to understanding that if it doesn't work, they are happier elsewhere, is something else that's pervasive. It is not there. None of these districts are districts that tolerate people who are not willing to do their best all the time. And when they don't, they don't stay. I mean, I actually had an interesting conversation, and I'll end with this anecdote. We were asking questions to a focus group of teachers around conflict and how conflict is resolved in the district. And one of the two, we had then had two focus groups, and they basically were saying we don't have much conflict here. And we thought, well, this can't be true. This is just not the nature of human beings. There's always some conflict somewhere. And one teacher said, I've taught in 2 other districts, and I have been in Gwinnett for 10 years, and I know what it's like to be somewhere else. And I would rather be here and do what's best for the student, and that's how we resolve all of our conflicts, than worry about myself and risk having to go work somewhere else.
Interesting. Well, both of these comments, I think, put some interesting things on the table for sort of the next conversation around what constitutes success and what are the challenges actually in measurement and evaluation in this space. Wanted to get Brad to talk a little bit about, and we have some data up on this slide, but about the federal investments in this area, and what's motivating them, or what's the sort of theory behind it.
I have to read this script that Ross just gave me. I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle than the slide does. What I'd like to do is to first talk about the challenges that we face, and then talk about what I think is a shift in the approach that we're trying to craft as we do our work right now, a shift in approach that is by no means complete, a shift that is not so much a repudiation of an old way of doing business as a response to a demand to do business in multiple ways. And then I'm going to end actually by getting us to not pay attention to the federal government, because I think that as much as you might want to, although I would warn you against it, the work that's going to be done in the field is going to be, I think, the place that we want to pay attention. And as I do that, I want to maybe make 1 or 2 calls to action. From the perspective of somebody that actually doesn't know Washington very well, I feel like I have less longevity than Lydia does. I've been here for 15 months, and I simply don't understand a lot of the circuitry in this city. This morning I was on Capitol Hill talking to appropriators in the Senate. I just don't get stuff like that. It's just an entirely different universe than the one I was in for 25 years in Denver Public Schools. So I'm going to confess ignorance and then say that there's really 3 daunting challenges that we have that make us do our work very differently: scale, complexity, and authority. The scale at which we operate is almost unimaginably large. And one of the few things that I do well is to translate that scale down to something that is comprehensible to people in the classroom, so that we can begin to see the connections between policy and practice. It's really difficult to talk about 54.5 million students and have it make sense. And it's really difficult to talk about 4.5 million ninth graders and have it make sense. But if what you do is to take America's ninth grade class and conjure it into a classroom of 30 students, and then realize that every ninth grade teacher who looks at those 30 kids will see only 23 complete high school, and they'll see only 15 go on to a post-secondary experience, and only 9 succeed in that post-secondary experience at the end of 6 years. Then I think you've got a problem that people can imagine at a scale that is relevant to them, and one that I think actually makes the kind of work that Dr. Wiest has been talking about incredibly doable. Because my job as a school teacher now is to get from 23 to 25, or maybe even 23 to 29, or to roll Yahtzee and get to 30. I mean, that would be great. And what that then does is it also begins to put a burden on me to drive up the 15 and to drive up the 9. The scale here means that we do our work on measurement and evaluation in ways that's absolutely gigantic, and it creates these studies that hit your email inbox with such a loud thud that Outlook pushes it back out and says, this is too big, I can't comprehend it. We did really good work most recently looking at teacher mentoring. That study that was put out by IES on teacher mentoring is great. It's also 450 pages long. You have to actually load a whole ream of paper in it to print it. And so, I think that the findings are really important. They begin to tell us a whole lot about the way we want to invest in teacher induction systems. It took us how many years? There are folks that have been around long enough to know the facts on this. It's an incredibly long study. It's like the NES study that has a little bit of argument in the background of it, but ultimately the NES study on teacher preparation, another one that hits the desk with a thud and tells us almost nothing, okay? But that's the work except that we need to build systems so that researchers can continue to research the problem, something incidentally I concur with. That kind of work that we do is a response to the problem of scale. Okay, there's a second problem, which is the problem of complexity. I don't need to reiterate to you how crazy our school system is. I have compared us to other world school systems, and all you got to do is put Great Britain, which is a single governmental entity that oversees basically its schools through three federated organizations: England, Scotland, and Wales, and compare it to the United States. And what you have on the one hand is a relatively simple system, and you've got pachinko on the other hand, that Japanese pinball game where you throw ball bearings through a bunch of nails and they sit. The complexity means that our research has to take place at a level of generality that makes it almost impossible for people to apply it in their local context. So the great work that was done by IES on this induction program is really difficult for people once they've plowed through the 450 pages of it to say, okay, how am I going to use this to inform the design of induction in Denver Public Schools? It's a really important study, makes a huge difference, but it doesn't tell us how to. And then finally, there's the extraordinary problems of authority in American public schooling, and it's a problem that I don't want to solve for, but it's one in which our perceived authority and our real authority are really different from one another, and it creates a very perverse relationship between us and the people we're researching. And frankly, it tells us that we need to go about our research in really mannered and stylized ways to produce very obscure information. And I'm coming to you with these challenges because I think you have to understand the way we're trying to change the way we're doing our work. And then finally, I'm going to come back right at you and say these are the things that I think are going to be more exciting. So here's how we're trying to change the way we're doing our work. We do know that the response to complexity in the past sometimes has been to create more complexity. Let's actually take something that's been good rather than something to be snippy about. Our investment in teacher preparation programs haven't been all bad, okay? The evolution of teacher quality enhancement to teacher quality partnerships is relatively good. And the program expectations of teacher quality partnership grants are not bad program expectations for designing teacher preparation programs. You might quibble with this aspect of it or that aspect of it, but ultimately, it's not necessarily a bad project. But it's a really hard grant program to administer, and it doesn't create the kind of inspired innovation that we wish for. And frankly, I don't think anybody around this table would say that it's fully satisfying. So moving away from that kind of grant program to something that is less restricted by design and more open-ended, I think is a challenge for us. It's interesting because when you build programs like the Teacher Quality Partnership, one of the counter responses in this city is to have special carve-outs for special organizations that don't match the Teacher Quality Partnership. And that is just more complexity on a complex system. It's also just getting what you need. And I don't think that from a federal perspective we're going to do away with this. I think it is what it is. But if what we can do is to begin to create at least some way to administering programs that is less about restrictions and then getting around the restrictions and more about trying to have channels for people to pursue in similar directions, we're going to do our work better. To that end, I think it's also worth the move from formula to competitive grant programs. And while we're not going to cut back the formula grant programs, and even among friends, I think I have to say that 3 times to prove it so that you don't go out and say, no, they're really cutting formula grant programs. The emphasis doesn't need a whole lot of explanation as we move to competitive grant programs, because Race to the Top stands as an example of what we're trying to do differently. I think the most interesting thing about Race to the Top is that it's run by people with a background in philanthropy and social capital movements, and that success is actually learning from the good work that you guys around the table have been teaching us for the last 10 years. I think I've covered the shift in approach that we're trying to engineer. We're not trying to give up these platinum standard studies, but I do think we need to think about how we can become more agile. John Easton is working very hard on that on the research end, just as Joanne Weiss and Arnie are on the program end, and I think you need to think about that. I'm going to now come back and say, we're never going to be as good as you are, but there are some things that you all may, I think in the conversation here, want to think hard about, especially as you're thinking about measuring effective teachers. The first is your obligation to tell a story to somebody other than the immediate community that you're in. That in fact is something that is really lacking. And what it means is, at least from my perspective, that the old-fashioned storytellers, the analog era storytellers, they're still winning, okay? You've got to get your digital stories, to keep using that analogy, into the field of vision and into the ears of people who need to hear them, because right now they're not hearing a counter story. What they keep asking over and over again is, what other than Denver is happening in the country on teacher pay? Or what other than Austin is happening on other than Austin in teacher pay? There's got to be more storytelling on your part. Obligations to your partners when you do evaluations will make a difference. A second thing that I would tell you is that your ability to create rapid response that feeds back to the school system so that they're in a pattern of continuous improvement is going to matter, especially as you engage with states in the next 10 years. The state is a new arena in which we're going to play, and your ability to create fast cycle information so that they can learn from the investments that are coming into them through competitive grant programs, your ability to synthesize multiple competitive grant programs into a story that's relevant to the state, that's a new game for all of us, but you're going to be able to do it better than we can. And then finally, there is right now an extraordinary burden that's being placed on the use of psychometrics to do all of the storytelling. And we may need to realize, as Dr. Wiest so eloquently pointed out, that in a human business, psychometrics has a limited role. Psychometrics is really important, but we don't use psychometrics to make judgments about lawyers and engineers. What we need to begin to do is to enhance the pragmatics of our system to make empowered judgments about how to do better. And the tools of pragmatic judgment come in 2 categories: pragmatic measures and the development of the will to make judgments. And I think one of the points that was made earlier was that we are different than many other sectors because we don't differentiate. I'm not capturing your point well, but as I've been thinking about this over the last 36 months, and especially over the last 15, the poverty in the will to decide in K-12 is huge. The consequences of it in the past has meant that we treat students that are below proficient as if they're going to turn out okay anyway. We treat teachers who are just barely able to do the job as if they're the same person who's really good at doing the job. And I think that Dr. Wiest has captured the human difficulty of doing this, but the human difficulty of it will fade if we build on pragmatics in both of these two categories. And you're going to be able to do that in ways that the federal government can't, because we've got these challenges of scale and complexity and authority that's confusing. And you're going to be in these really important interventions, especially new interventions with the state, where you're going to be able to make differences. I hope that's the way you wanted me to talk.
I never invest too much in hoping about that. But actually, let me ask you one follow-up question. So, you talked, it's just interesting, the interplay between sort of that scale and complexity. So IES was able to commission this, ginormous study of mentoring and induction, and the 400 and whatever pages just came out. Just so you know, I've read the executive summary. The executive summary is 25 pages. An executive summary is 25 pages. I mean, actually, that's a big challenge. But I'm curious if you have ideas about how to leverage that. What ought that study to mean to where philanthropy is going in their work? What is it? What should be taken? I'm just curious about that as a particular example of something that just landed. And how do we make use of it? I mean, it was tens of millions of dollars, 5 years, and then you get these findings. Just if you could, I don't know if you want to reflect on it for a minute, and we'll come back, or if you have an idea.
I think it's a really interesting question. I think that there's two layers to the answer. The first is that we certainly hope you respond to our slow idea engine. And we think that there ought to be greater effort, perhaps through aggregation of your separate interests into a more common voice to inform us about the kind of long-term work and even the way we could conduct short-term work so that it is different and better and more responsive to your interests. Nevertheless, we still hope that reports like this one do shift the way you're investing. That goes without saying, okay? We do need to tune up our relationship with one another so that perhaps we're more responsive. But I think here's the second, and I can't emphasize this more. Your independence, your ability to run circles around our direction, your ability to tell more complicated stories, your ability to dig more deeply in the local context just simply can't be gainsaid. And so in some ways we've got to turn you into a tool that is informing us instead of reacting to us. And right now, the work that you all do is too onesie-twosie for us to respond to. Aggregating your work so that it drives us is as important as aggregating, as responding to our work and thinking about what you want collectively so that you can respond to our work as we feed it out in our slow way. I mean, I think the most important thing that you all could do is to begin to treat us as the separate beast we are, get to know the way we do business, and then to use us like a cheap knight on the town. That's the best way that I can explain it.
Cheaper, and like nobody else could. So actually, I mean, some of the things you said really helped to transition into this next conversation about what constitutes success and what are the challenges in measurement and evaluation, because this sort of, you talked about this need for more storytelling and storytelling that moves beyond potentially some of the debates we've been having to some of the new understandings we have to have. And so thinking about what that means, what the implications of that are, I think really sort of helps push us into that space. Gary, before we transition there, I don't know if you've spent a lot of time thinking about sort of the federal investments and how they could be leveraged or where they ought to be going. So curious if you have some.
So I get to be the federal government can guy. That's how I feel about that. Well, for those of you who may not know, the Commission on No Child Left Behind has been obviously focused on how do we improve that law. And way back early in our work, we were sort of out there on that. How do we go from NCLB's wrong target of certifications and looking at teacher quality and shift toward teacher effectiveness as we move toward having better student data, better student improvement data, all of those things that can better inform what's happening in the classroom, make that connection, but also not just for accountability purposes, but can give us potentially better tools to help teachers get better. to support them more effectively. A lot has happened in that conversation since our first round of work. And what we're really wrestling with now, and Brad, your colleague, Mike Johnston, Senator Mike Johnston, chairs this effort for us on our Teacher Effectiveness Committee, is looking at how do we create an ESEA that gives us a policy environment that pushes us forward on the things we need to push forward on, using the data the way we need to use data, creating an environment where we're actually doing evaluation in ways that are valuable both from the accountability perspective and the teacher support perspective. And also getting at how do we do that in a way that, you know, we talk about the limitations of value-added data and all of those kinds of things now, but how do we sort of look to the future and say, well, we're going to have higher expectations. We're going to have richer data than we have now. We're going to have theoretically improved assessments, hopefully sort of built to give us better information to inform so we can use it for the proper stakes. So what we're really focused on is how do we get that ESEA balance right that doesn't get prescriptive and get in the way of good things that are happening or could happen or would happen with good leadership, but also creates an environment with federal law, an environment where if we don't have that kind of leadership, they're going to find their way to the right answers. We're going to have the right answers out there, and we're going to have transparency on the right things for the decisions that get made.
Great. So I think really actually helpful sort of transition between these two comments in terms of a conversation around what constitutes success, what are the hurdles in measurement and evaluation design, and where could philanthropy sort of push that. And actually want to turn to Kate Walsh in a minute, if you would. I mean, your center has done so much to look at sort of what states are doing, what information they're using, not using, and sort of just want to get your thoughts on kind of where this work should be going to make sure evaluation systems give both sort of inside the system the information they need and outside the system policymakers, grantors, the public, the information it needs to have confidence that things are moving in the right direction. I want to give you a second to think about that and sort of tee up, if anybody, you might see I'm sort of stuck on this idea of going from analog to digital, and also, Gary put on the table the Common Core state standards that are really going to be trying to pitch things at a higher level than they have in the past. Those assessments hopefully will be coming online. We don't have them. And how do we think about the transition of having focused our systems on these state tests, such as they are for the last decade, and what it's going to mean to kind of really help people get the image of what instruction, what student learning ought to look like moving forward? Because it seems like there's potentially a vital role for sort of philanthropy and outside partners in making those transitions and explaining those. So curious if anybody's working on that or making investments in that space that would inform this thinking. But Kate, will you kick us off?
Well, I think we've seen some tremendous progress in the past 6 months, what with states understanding the importance of evaluation, and we have about 12 to 15 states, depends on how you want to read it, that have made student learning an important component, if not the majority component of teacher evaluation. So what the next step promises may be utter disaster or with some intervention, I think, from the philanthropic community, particularly Gates. It might be extremely promising. I'm particularly pessimistic about states' capacity to take these new laws and turn them into anything that is either fair to teachers or which actually reflects student learning. So Jerry Weiss is over there nodding because I serve on the state board, and Jerry in Maryland, and Jerry had he had to come before the state board and sort of say, no, we don't want to sign on your race to the top. And I'm very sympathetic to the feelings of a district that has spent a lot of time figuring this out and having a state sort of trumpet the benefits of doing this. But So I absolutely want to underscore that I think that states will mess this up unless they are given some really clear guidance from the philanthropic community and from others that are thinking about this. And certainly we see that as a role that we can play in trying to navigate us towards some more realistic and fair and valid measures. And I'm not shy about saying this, having spent some time looking at what Gates is doing. I'm really genuinely excited about what's coming out of this Gates project. And I don't say this because they're one of my funders. I'm not known for being politic. I really think what Gates is going to be offering states and districts in the next year or so may prevent states from heading off disaster. So states from going into a disastrous mode. But so I don't know if that provides enough context here for what we need to do, but this whole notion of multiple measures and how to use it fairly and accurately, and there's a sort of this ambiguous phrase of 50% of a teacher's performance is going to be 50% of teacher's performance is going to be student learning, and of that only a third or whatever it will be test scores. And then what do you do about what do you do when most teachers are not in a tested subject? People are going to be very much struggling to figure that out. And so the more work we can do up front to bring some kind of concrete guidance and put it on the table is just absolutely critical. And I think there are paths being forged now, like with the impact system of DC. I think that is going to provide some excellent models for us. I think KIP, I think what you guys have done has laid some groundwork. But I'm with Brad on this one. If those models aren't better communicated somehow to the general public, and not to the general public, but to states, I'm just a little pessimistic about what states will pull off.
So yeah, so Jerry and then Lydia. I mean, I think one of the challenges is it's probably both, but where do we land in terms of, do we mostly have a storytelling challenge or mostly a sort of design and development challenge in terms of how to actually get this work situated? And again, I guess it's both, but figuring out what to tell stories about and how do we know?
Well, my guess is we're about a year ahead of ourselves. I mean, states have jumped on this bandwagon without having a clue about what it is they're going to do to solve it. And I think we're about a year behind in the work that we need to deliver that would secure really some good answers. So one of the things I'm a little worried about is that Race to the Top will put pressure on states to have an accelerated timeline that they shouldn't have. And I think if there's one thing the department could do, it would be to encourage states that it's okay to have a slower timeline than they might think is necessary to secure a grant.
Yeah.
Got that, Brad?
So, Jerry, want to turn to you, and I'm hoping, in addition to whatever you want to put in this, that you could talk a little bit about getting back to this idea. Kate talked about she's pessimistic about sort of being smart about taking account of student learning. And Brad talked about the pressure and that we're putting on the psychometrics that we have right now. Just curious how you manage this in Montgomery County, that particular challenge in Montgomery County.
We'll hold that thought just for a second, and then I'll talk about it. I'm still a little sore with the Kipsters because I tried to get a KIP school in Montgomery County about 8 years ago. Actually, I built a place for them. And they stole my Kipster and sent it down to Baltimore. There's no hard feelings on it, This was back when it wasn't popular. I was.
And it's still not popular in Baltimore. They still have, they almost been kicked out.
And my council was going to withhold my funding if I got on a train, went up and studied the KIPS school. That's how unpopular it was. And I'm very much a good charter supporter. not a fly-by-night. Here's what I learned, and I won't talk about Montgomery, I want to talk about KIPP. They had common outcome. They knew exactly what they wanted to get done. I like that. So there was no ambiguity of clarity about what your job is and what you were going to accomplish with every kid. They didn't say you're going to spend 55 minutes on math and 32 minutes on this, and all of that nonsense that comes with structures that build a culture that is non-performing. They built a culture around what they wanted to accomplish. Everything was tailored to push that culture. All the data, all the feedback, how they used time, and there was clear understanding, and it was understood when you were signing on what you were signing on for. Am I getting it right?
That's right.
Are you recruiting him, Susan?
No. That's what we tried to design in answering what Steve was talking about. We tried to make our work less complex with more clarity and having everything head there. Then your evaluation is about something that you're doing, not about all these other things. The more we were able to listen to people and understand all of the miscommunication we had introduced into the system to cause it to be reactive, the more we opened our eyes to our blind spots and conditions of how much we had structured that was going nowhere, the more we were able to move towards a level of support in a KIPP-like environment where there was clarity of outcomes, clarity of purpose, clarity in your hiring, alignment in what you're doing, and support to get it done. And feedback and data loops then became more meaningful because they could keep track of what you're trying to do. My fear in answering your question is people won't think about that and just introduce another evaluation system, of which I've seen a dozen in my 40 years, into a system that is dysfunctional structurally. Structurally. Because if you don't look at the structure, you will not understand the culture, and if you don't understand the culture, you will introduce another silver bullet that you can't go to scale with and people can't execute on because it doesn't fit within the culture that they're working.
So just to try and follow up on that, it seems like one of the things that's allowed for lots of different cultures of varying functionality is that student learning hasn't always actually been at the center of how we understand what's happening in schools. We observe lots of different things, but we haven't been very good at saying, how do we as a community within a school, within a system, know whether students are learning what we want them to or not? And just curious how Montgomery County has tried to work on that.
We've tried to integrate the learning where there's themes that get kids college ready, like critical thinking, problem solving, metacognition, those kind of things, run through all of it. And we've tried to take this disparate type of things that everybody wants a kid to be able to know and do, and if you ask them, the list is a mile long, okay? And boil that down into more of an integrated pattern. And we're actually now trying to build an integrated curriculum before we run out of money to bring that all together. Because right now the structure is very inefficient. And the only thing in the structure that seems to be predictable in the country is that you can actually sort by race and socioeconomics and actually geography, if you think about it. And that's all the system is good at predicting. What we're trying to do is build a more integrated curriculum that has an outcome that can be measured with some degree of less wobble in a quicker time frame that is more that everybody buys into, that's clear and engaging, that can be put into a continuous improvement model where the system's processes are aligned to that outcome, and then measure what is missing and try to find the support systems necessary. So the whole thing of a professional growth system is try to find the supports necessary for the effectiveness of the teacher, rather than I'm evaluating you for raises or evaluating you for elimination. And we just found that to be a better way to go about it, at least in our place.
Ross, can I just put one point in here that I think is important in the context of what Jerry's talking about? I really worry that what Montgomery County needs, which is one of the most high-performing systems in the nation, and what Baltimore City needs are two very different animals. I mean, and like who was talking earlier about identifying the low performers, and I mean, Jerry doesn't have a lot of low-performing teachers, at least not anywhere near the problem that large urban areas do. So the system that might work very well in Montgomery County doesn't look much like the one in Baltimore City.
I agree with you. We do not differentiate between the systems, just like we don't differentiate between the schools nor the teachers. And so whatever system to be really effective has got to be differentiated just like you would with kids. I'm total agreement with you. And the problem is that when we make these structures, that's what I was railing about. Why 50%? I mean, what is that number? What do we stake in that number on? Why, you know, I mean, when we really think about it, when we say we're going to use 50% of student scores, what's our evidence base behind that?
Well, you asked that question to me
Yeah.
before, and I think the answer is easy. I have no problem defending it. It's preponderance of student learning should be the majority of what we look at.
All right, well, let's not actually try that debate right now. Clearly something that could use some more work on it. Lydia, you've been waiting to jump in, and then I know there's two comments over here, so we'll go there
And
next.
mine is a brief comment that goes back to the structure piece, which is we have work that we're doing in some states and districts where the timing of the assessments doesn't give you good information about the teacher, and it doesn't give you back information in time to help that teacher improve or not. By the time they're assessed the students get their assessments in October. Teacher's been in the classroom for 6 weeks, so it's right after summer learning loss. You might be getting some of what the last teacher got. You're not really getting much of what the current year teacher got and was able to give the students. And by the time you get the information back, it's either the end of the year or the beginning of the next year. Obviously, we are very invested in these high stakes evaluations that will quickly push to higher, teachers striving for higher effectiveness in student learning. But there are some structural things as we move to, not national these two consortia of national assessments, collecting additional data, having more evaluations that are based on student learning, that the structure of how we are assessing across states is not the same. It's not just which assessment we're using, but when we're using it and when we actually get the data that can tell us something about what's happening.
Yeah, and how to think about it seems this continuing challenge of how to get the information we need when we need it. So that data is great when it comes, months and months after actually a teacher or a principal could use it to understand what's going on right then that needs to change. So thinking about how we get the information when we need it is a huge ongoing challenge. I know there were two.
Someone want to get in the queue.
Okay.
I'd like to get in the queue too, because Jim Collins.
Okay, so we've got two comments, and then I have four in a row.
So I want to rip off of something that Dr. Wiest and Ross you said quite a bit earlier. Just listening to your reflections on KIPP and what the work that you're trying to do, as well as your concern about, we focus on evaluation and look at it as a silver bullet. We're going to drop it in a dysfunctional system. It's not going to work any better. I think a lot of us, we're sort of sitting around a table, and we're poking around an elephant, which we're not talking about, although Kate Walsh has talked about it a great deal in her work, which is, why is it that in education, as opposed to law or medicine, the schools of education are not filling the gap around what professional standards should be? We would have, a lot of these questions would not be so fraught if more teachers and educators actually felt like, okay, I know enough about what to do about getting to these very clear goals. I have the tools already to get to these very clear goals. We have, unfortunately, I think in this country, we have a black hole where the entities and the institutions that generally in professions actually fill it are not. And therefore, either we have in 99% of school districts, we have a performance and a compliance culture. We just do this because we know what's better. Or we have systems that are very even though they're supposed to create simplicity, they lead to, they're very complicated to build, which is the one that Dr. Wiest has created. You need to have more institutions, these infra-institutions that are not simply telling people do this or you'll be punished, but rather building a field.
It's a great comment, and I think there's a distinction though when you talked about why aren't the preparation programs here, but then you also moved over to this is something the profession needs to take account of, and figuring out where that work happens I think is a challenge. I don't know if any of the rest of you went to law school, but I will tell you law school doesn't prepare you much better for being a lawyer than ed schools do, and yet the profession has figured out what it means to develop people and sort of culturate them to the profession. So actually I think continuing a really interesting role there also for philanthropy and figuring out where does this training most effectively happen and how, what kind of sequencing. So Kelly, did you want to jump in?
First of all, I wanted to appreciate that this conversation has been a lot about student voice and using video. I was afraid that I was going to come today and it was going to be about standardized testing and how to measure teachers using that, and I'm afraid that's what the national current has been. I think we know that didn't work with NCLB and has really hurt the culture of schools and what's happening for students, and so why we would move that problem into this conversation with teacher effectiveness just baffles me. If we think about what we do in our work and what we contribute to our fields, just as how, in regards to how we think, how we solve problems, how we create products of lasting value, and then if tomorrow someone told you that you are going to take a multiple choice test that was mostly based on content and that's how your performance was going to be assessed, I think we'd all be outraged. But somehow that's still part of the conversation of how we're going to assess students, and I don't think that's a fair way to treat them. This is probably unpopular, but the 5 years that I was a school leader, we met 3 to 4 times in the morning before school, and we never had one conversation about standardized testing. So I want to contribute some other ideas of how we can not just measure and evaluate teacher effectiveness, because I think that's the wrong wording for the conversation. I think it's really about supporting teachers and becoming reflective practitioners. And part of that is measurement and evaluation, but that's not the heart of the conversation, because like Jim said at the very start, sometimes what gets left out is how are we using that data, how are we using that measurement to help support teachers in becoming better teachers, which is really the larger goal of the conversation. So just 3 ideas to put out there. At our schools, so I work at High Tech High, the way that we measure teacher effectiveness is really in the sophistication of the student work, not in standardized testing. And so I think Gates, if you can get 13,000 video observations, I know there's probably really creative ways that you can also bring student work into the conversation, whether it's video presentations or actual samples of student work, and get evaluators to kind of look at that. So at our school, students are producing documentaries, they're publishing books, they're doing presentations of learning. So I think that needs to enter into the conversation. I know that's difficult for funders, I know that's difficult at the federal level, but I think that's what matters, and so I think we need to think about that. As far as engagement, I think we also need to talk about pedagogy. So we're a project-based learning school, and if students are not doing work that is for an authentic purpose, an authentic audience, then it's difficult for them to see the value in it. So for example, a 12th grade team this year did integrated projects with humanities and art, and they worked with a local veteran center. They worked with individual veterans, interviewed them, created short films, created poetry, and actually an art piece about a memory that they had from their years in war. And then they exhibited that at a public exhibition, and one of my advisory students actually worked with someone who was blind, and he said that was the most interesting part of the experience, was creating artwork for someone who would not be able to see the artwork and being able to express that not just visually but communicate his ideas in that way. So I think we need to add that into the conversation. What is the student work, and how are teachers engaging students in that work? 2 other ideas. I think we need to help, or when we're looking at evaluation, I think when I've seen teachers improve the most, it's because they're reflective practitioners. So if we're using video and other tools, or we're using student surveys, I think we should also be assessing how teachers are using that to guide their practice. So oftentimes as a director, I would meet with teachers and we'd look at student feedback, and then we'd have a conversation about how they were using that feedback to inform their practice. Or I would go into their classroom and get video of their teaching. They'd pick a 5-minute clip that they found interesting, they were having a question about, and then I would not go into their classroom and tell them what they were doing right or wrong, but I'd help guide them through a reflective conversation. And so I think that can be measured in some way. It's kind of difficult to measure, but how reflective are they as a practitioner? And then the third one, we're putting a lot on teachers without putting a lot on school leaders in schools. So how are schools developing adult learning communities? So are they expecting all of this progress from teachers, but they still only meet 3 or 4 times a year? They stick 100 teachers into the library and the principal talks at the front of the room to them. Or are they meeting regularly? Are they collaborating? So we meet 3 to 4 times a week. We use a lot of protocols for tutoring projects, looking at student work, collegial coaching, so it's not just the principal getting video and then giving feedback to the teachers, but teachers are getting into each other's classrooms, getting video and talking about it with each other. So when we talk about measuring teacher effectiveness, what are school leaders doing to develop that adult learning community?
Great. Those were great comments, and I think actually really put some images on the table of how some of the work that's going on could be complemented, which was part of the purpose for today. Jim, did you want to jump in, and then Brad?
Yeah, I just wanted to make 2 comments on out of the stream of really very interesting and compelling arguments that are being made here. The notion that my colleagues in Montgomery County, this idea of the metaphor of differentiated instruction to be extended to differentiated approaches to different kinds of systems when we think about introducing evaluation in and how it gets integrated into the practice and the improvement of student learning. We have a tremendous range here. So from the KIP, our colleagues from KIP, talking about, and it was a very interesting comment early on that wasn't picked up on, which is that the culture isn't that big an issue. It's more the technical aspects of it. But again, when you think about differentiated approaches, in the KIP schools, the people are choosing to be there and have been chosen to be there. So it's not surprising that the culture isn't the biggest issue, because you're in some sense controlling for the culture by bringing in folks who will share values and norms with the people that they're working with. The same with a high-performing system like Montgomery County versus a really struggling or dysfunctional system. We have to differentiate how we treat those systems with respect to the introduction of investments from philanthropies and other places about what's going to make a difference in these systems to get something started. What I'd like to put on the table is this idea maybe there are common catalysts for the kind of change that we're talking about to be more data-driven and more have the evaluations be more effective in being used. So maybe there's some introductions of common approaches like some of the ones that Kelly was just talking about, which is we are going to look at student learning. Yes, we are going to look at teacher practice, but we are also going to look at teachers' practices with each other, which is where, in some sense, some of the greatest differentiation is going to be, is how do teachers spend their time with each other, talking about whatever data it is that they are looking at, and then what comes out of those conversations in terms of action and change. And the last thing that we might want to look at in terms of a common thing we want to look at as a catalyst for change in terms of evaluation and assessment is what's the quality of the supports that these schools are getting in these different starting point situations, the quality of supports to make this change. So we've talked about differentiating between individual student learning being assessed, the quality of teaching and learning being assessed, the quality of teacher practice with each other, the use of common planning time and professional development with each other, but also what's the quality and intensity of supports that are being received to create change in that district, and the kind of support that's being provided to a KIP school or to a Montgomery County or to a Baltimore County might have to be different, but an assessment of what the intensity and quality needs to be to get started on something moving forward from whatever level people start needs to be part of this conversation, I think.
Great. So Brad, and then I'm going to sort of talk about where I'm hoping we'll go, and then actually let you grab some lunch. Brad.
So I'm pretty convinced that my job here is to constantly give you all more work rather than to accept it for ourselves. And so what I want to do is I want to connect the last 2 comments back to Lydia's open-ended question, because I think there's a lot that can be done by this community to make that connection. What's interesting about the last 2 comments is their insistence that the social context of the work of teaching, whether it's the examination of student work, whether it's the construction of relations among adults in a workplace, that these are the things of which we're going to make the boost in learning that we seek, and I concur with that. And I think it's with all due respect to the previous 2 commenters, it's so obvious that it's astonishing to me that we're only now coming back to it, and we're doing so with a kind of insistence that we feel like we're beating back an old argument that said that that wasn't what we were doing. I mean, it's just astonishing to me as a former teacher that we're in this position saying, no, we've got to look at individual student work. And my point here isn't to say that they're wrong, it's to say that they're right, and then ask, how do you actually answer the question that Lydia posed? And this is something I think that philanthropy can do. And this is a good reason to point to the Measures of Effective Teaching project. If Tom Kane taught me anything, it is the importance of using measures to predict student performance on a clumsy, lousy measure that we ultimately can share because it has some common currency, and that's its real value. And what I want to do is to point out two things for us to ponder about over our lunch. The first is, I don't think that the large-scale assessment systems are as bad as Lydia described, and I think the challenge under the Common Core and the challenge of the Race to the Top assessment competition is to take another step forward in the process of making a system that's not as bad as people think it is, even though they hate it, and make it better, even though they're still gonna hate it. And then not to try and tease the wrong things out of it. Large-scale assessment systems don't give teachers information to inform instruction. Let's just quit telling ourselves that, okay? They just don't give you enough information as a teacher. The idea that I'm gonna be able to figure out more from the Colorado CSAT test about my ninth grader's ability to write a persuasive paragraph and looking at his persuasive paragraph is falderal, okay? And my ability to generate generalized information about my class from that large-scale assessment data is also falderal, but that information will tell us something. Here's my point. If we can begin to reach agreement, this is something that you all can do and we can't, on what college and career ready means. And I think it's going to be an agreement reached among states that are participating in assessment consortia that are aligned with the Common Core in some way. But if we can begin to reach agreement, what you begin to then do is you begin to be able to have a common pole star against which you can navigate the trajectories of all your students, and you can begin to navigate the collective and individual works of your teachers. Your ability as a teacher to look at student work is meaningless unless what you're doing is looking at that student work and saying, is this child on track to being college and career ready? Is this the kind of writing we want from a ninth grader? And if this isn't, how are we going to help this child write more like a ninth grader? And the common agreement among states about what college and career ready will then enable is for equation across at least those states, if not states that aren't in that game, about progress of their students towards those. Tony or Steve will say that this is really hard psychometrics, but it's a much easier problem for which to solve than many of the other social problems that you've described. The idea of being able to equate growth measures across multiple states, progress towards a common pole star goal, is a much easier psychometric problem than the kinds of work that you've just put before us, which is to be able to figure out what great ninth grade writing looks like and to be able to help teachers figure out in a community of practice how to make instructional intervention. That's really hard work. This psychometric exercise is something that you could invest in collectively. It might make Steve lose some hair because it's hard work, but it is, I think, at least the right work. And again, the federal government can't do it without the looming specter of black helicopters. So if you guys can do it, that'd be great.
All right. So lots to ponder there. I want to be cognizant that folks have been patient and we've gone over a little bit. Lunch is waiting outside. If folks could grab their lunch and come back in, let's take 15 minutes so you can, because I'm very appreciative that folks have been very engaged and people maybe need to check in with folks or want to say hi to folks that they know or folks that they don't yet know. But let's try and really pick it back up at 12:45. We're only going to have 45 minutes together at that point, and I think there's still lots of terrain I'd like to get you guys to help us cover. So if we can break until 12:45, lunch is right out there, and you can bring it back in here. Thanks. We've talked some about how we use it in systems. I think it's also this question of what's its value for informing the broader conversation and for understanding whether work is successful or not. So we talked some, I thought Jerry Weist's comments from Montgomery County, especially those last ones about curriculum and how you've got to use, just sort of putting Jerry and Brad's conversations or comments together. I mean, you've got to have this pole star. You've got to have something that you're aiming towards, but then what do you start to build out underneath that? Because it doesn't go from that goal to just saying now everybody do what you need to do to get there. There's a tremendous amount of infrastructure that's got to be built that supports all of this work. And so thinking about not just what's the data that the system needs to get better itself, but how does that data relate to understanding? How do external partners, actors, policymakers, the public understand whether it's working out or not? So actually wanted to, Cindy Brown from Center for American Progress spends a lot of time thinking about how to explain these things to the broader audiences that need to understand whether the system's improving or not. And so wanted to get your reflections on this set of issues, Cindy.
Thanks, Ross. It's always interesting to be in conversations like this because it's where I and my colleagues get a lot of the ideas for what we then write about or commission writing about. I want to go back to
Ross?
Yeah.
Ross, this is Susan Dawson. Can I interrupt?
So Cindy Brown from Center for American Progress is commenting right now, and then is it okay if then we come back to you?
Yes, I apologize. Could you ask Cindy to sit next to the microphone?
Oh, okay, yeah. Yes. Sorry about that. I wasn't talking into the microphone. So I want to go back to the point that was mentioned this morning about telling stories about what's going on in the fields that we're working with, particularly around evaluation and notions of what's successful. And I know Ross asked me we do that a lot. We have to chunk those stories a bit. You can't keep saying you've got to do everything. Everything has to be comprehensive reform. You've got to shine a light on what the elements of that are. And there's always a danger in that. I think of Kate's comments earlier about capacity and her worry that states are going to put in place some kind of evaluation system that doesn't take into account the kind of differentiation that Jerry Weiss was talking about. But you still have to try to tell stories about how these things can be done. And when we do that, two of the more recent ones was we've looked at peer evaluation systems, and we also did a study of evaluations in high-performing charter schools. And in each instance, we try to give 3 or 4 different examples of how these things can work. And our goal, what we do is we commission this work from the researchers that many of you fund. And then we give them very strict instructions: write this for a policy audience. Do not talk to us about your methodology of how you did your research, or to summarize it briefly, and we put it in the appendix, never in the body of what we do. And we try to make it, we have high-powered editors who work with us. It's not easy to make documents accessible, but if you want to replicate, if you want to get policymakers to stop doing the things they're doing and to do the kinds of things we think have a better shot at getting success with student outcomes, then you have to show them and lead them through this, and then you have to have a big communication structure to get that information out, and that's what we try to do. But you have to always be speaking in an authentic voice, which means we commission our work from the people who are really working in these areas. Sometimes we write things internally because we have enough experts on our staff as well, but so to me it's about telling these stories for policymakers that you want to stop doing the bad stuff and try to move in a direction that has more promise. I just will say that on the study of mentoring, the results that we're also excited about only developed in the 3rd year of the study, right, Kate? And the first 2 years were disappointing you have to stick with these studies and stick with these experiments, and then people and, you know, the kind of thing I do, we can then tell the story when we get the evidence, but I don't think you can underestimate the importance of commitment to an investment over time, so that we can see if there are better ways of doing things.
So, Steve, curious if you have any reactions to that or just reflections on this, given your work on that particular, in this area. But I think it's a really important point around the political conversation is so fixated on short-term results. And, you know, out of, I think, really legitimate and sort of, you know, good faith concerns about the urgency of what we're facing. But how do we balance that with a recognition that sometimes actually the results don't pan out? Even if they're going to be positive in the sort of the first year or even 2 years that you're doing something, and sort of figuring out the implications of that for philanthropy and for partners in the work seems really important as well. Steve?
Thanks. Well, it's nice to know, after having spent the last 5.5 years working on that study, that people have at least downloaded it and tried to print it out. It's actually not that long.
Oh, but clearly we may need to talk. We need a shorter version.
There's a 15-page executive summary and a 1-page summary on our website, but but yeah, I'd be happy to give you a 1-paragraph version, and that includes the pictures and the graphs. But I mean, there is a real trade-off between timeliness and rigor in producing research, and I want to not be naive to think that the research to practice loop works like you do a big study and then you finish it, you announce the results, and everybody starts doing what you recommend. People have been asking me, literally on the cab ride over here, somebody called me and asked, what should districts do now? And I tried to repeat what the study found and what it could mean, but I don't even think that very large, rigorous studies are meant to be a prescriptive, because nobody's going to discount their own beliefs immediately. What it does is it accumulates with what you already know as a practitioner. If you've been in the classroom for 20, 30 years and been administrator for 15 years, then I expect that you're going to have some prior beliefs about the effectiveness of comprehensive teacher induction. Now, I hope that the rigor of a study like this that IES had the foresight to fund would tell you, wow, maybe my long-held beliefs that this particular intervention is going to produce, is going to help me retain teachers more than whatever I'm already doing, maybe you'll reconsider that, or maybe you'll go back to the drawing board and think, well, this model that they use, what did they do? Well, full-time release mentors, where somebody's, all they're doing all the time is mentoring teachers, that sounds like a great model. But maybe we're overlooking something. Maybe there's some value to having somebody who's in your building, because if you have 12 beginning teachers you're responsible for, you're bouncing around between schools, and you're not right there to be buttonhole necessarily. Maybe there's advantages and disadvantages and trade-offs that we hadn't thought about before. So the idea of a strong research study is to challenge beliefs, or to change beliefs in a certain direction, but they don't necessarily generate consensus overnight. So I don't want to set up those kinds of expectations. But I do want to generate the interest in the value of doing this kind of research that requires some patience, and also acknowledging the value of a null result, or a result that wasn't expected. I mean, when we started the study, everybody thought that it wasn't a question of whether there would be impacts, it's how large are they going to be? Are they going to justify the large cost of this kind of expensive intervention? And after 1 year, we found there was no impact on anything. Teachers weren't even more satisfied. They didn't feel better prepared if they were in this treatment group than the control group teachers. And this is the same thing after the second year and after the third, into the fourth year of teaching. So there are a number of things that people were frankly just surprised by. And it was only because the methodology had been sort of hashed out ahead of time, we got consensus on the study design. It was only at that point that people were discussing the findings and what they mean, and not arguing over the methodology. And that's really, that's a definition of success. And the fact that the control group, that we measured what the control group was doing, there's a lot of teacher induction going on in school districts that told us in 2004, we don't have the money to have a decent teacher induction program. we can't afford full-time mentors. Well, something's going on. Something's going on that district leaders did not know about. And maybe it's coming out of the hide of veteran teachers who are staying after school to work with their junior colleagues who are struggling. Maybe there's something that principals are doing creatively, or the way that they're using Title I funded reading coaches or something. And that's worth looking into. So the idea of generating new questions is a success. The idea of shedding light on what current practice is, because I don't think that we have some national surveys that ask broad questions about whether you have a mentor, but we didn't know a whole lot in these that we do in these 17 large urban districts about what usual practices in incredible detail. I'm sure there's people who think that the 50-page chapter on induction services that teachers received isn't even long enough, and so other researchers, I hope, will get the data that we generated and dig even deeper, and this will be a resource to continue generating knowledge it's not meant to tell you what to do, it's not prescriptive, but to help move your beliefs along and complement what you know from working every day in the classroom with these teachers, and hopefully, because I learn a lot by hearing stories from people who work in schools, and hopefully those folks can learn a lot by what we do by having a data set that has, where we followed 1,000 teachers over a 4-year period.
Thanks. Diane, I know you had wanted to jump in, and then Susan Dawson, I don't know if you had just wanted to clarify that Cindy needed to talk on the microphone, or whether you wanted to jump in. So if you do, we'll have you on tap for next. But Diane, you had some sort of follow-up to actually something that was put on the table in the prior conversation.
Yes, you must have been a waiter asking questions when someone just took a bite. That's the sign of a previous wait person. I just wanted to build off some of the discussion that happened right before the lunch. From New Leaders for New Schools perspectives, we do believe very strongly that school leadership plays a key role in thinking about the growth of teacher effectiveness. And we have, over the past couple of years, been taking a real hard look at our highest gain school leaders across the country from 10 different urban areas. And we're now putting together a principal effectiveness model that it's early stages, but there are 3 key components of that to assess a principal's effectiveness. One is certainly student achievement gains. The other are performance metrics that we think align to human capital strategy, to culture. Cultural norms are critical in that rubric. But the other is teacher effectiveness and the growth of the effectiveness of teachers in the school building. And this is something that, again, we're just getting our hands around, and we're working with a couple of states right now in thinking about this as a key component of teacher effectiveness and the role of the school leader. And so I would just like to put on the table that as we're talking about what's happening in the classroom, we also have to be very thoughtful about our school leaders and equipping those school leaders with an understanding of their responsibility, making sure that they're accountable for helping teachers improve and grow in their classroom effectiveness. So that was, I just wanted to build a little bit off of what Kelly had said.
Great. So, I'm curious. Well, first, Susan, did you want to jump in?
Thank you. Can I jump in now? I'm getting a delay here of a few seconds, so I want to make sure it's working.
That seems to be fine.
Thank you. That's a good segue, because I had just wanted to emphasize, which we've now just done more recently, the critical connection to leadership and campus leadership. One of the things that we are additionally looking at is comparing to other industry models. For instance, nursing has many, many parallels to teachers, a very critical role that's played, high demand environment, typically underpaid, typically not inducted as well as we would like. And we have found some hospital system models that we are starting starting to compare against in our region, where leadership at the hospital system has put in place new policies and cultural changes around significantly reducing turnover. And then when that turnover was reduced, solved a whole lot of problems, not just around effectiveness, certainly around effectiveness, but also around cost, around lowering costs of induction, lowering costs of mentoring, things like that. So I would just add to the conversation as we're looking at and creating that culture, that there are models in other industries that we can start to, I think, look to and bring back to educational systems. I'm going to mute it now because you'll get feedback otherwise.
Okay, well, thanks. Thank you for that comment, because I do think it's another interesting area to explore. Just how do we leverage lessons from other sectors? I think there's obvious and easy ways to discount that and sort of say, well, we're so different, but I actually think there's a lot to mine there, and that I feel like is coming around a little bit. You see it popping up in a number of different, if not formal studies, than just how people are starting to process these issues. Want to see if there's any reflections on, one of the guiding questions we put into the agenda was around if we're trying to get good measures to help us understand what's going on or not, what are the cautions we need to have in mind? Where can data be potentially misleading or not helping us to really understand what we need to know about system success and improvement? And I guess, so there's a complementary question to that, which just curious if anybody has reflections on information that ends up getting produced to satisfy grant requirements, either from, obviously there's many from the federal government or from funders that end up not being, sort of useful for the work and that potentially create things to go towards or move towards that actually aren't where substantively we'd want the work to head. And likewise, are there places where measures get put in place that weren't things the system we're looking at, but actually illuminate some of the cost benefits, some of the issues that are important. So curious if anybody has any reflections on the sort of data quality itself and what we're using. Susan, that's what you.
I think test scores for us, obviously it's something that KIP keeps an eye on. But I also feel like in the greater, having to scale up and track this stuff is very difficult. And I think being able to look at test scores first as an indicator, it's very rare that you see a low-performing school getting high test scores or high-performing schools getting dramatically low test scores. So I do think it's a great place to start any conversation as a group of funders or evaluators. And then I do think you need to start digging in deeper. And it's just sort of, in terms of always trying to sort things out, I do think you can look at data and start, having that as your starting point, but then you need to delve into what's working, what's not working. And it kind of goes back to, Ross, what you're asking, which is, sometimes I feel like at KIP or other charter schools or other Teach for America, we do try to make funders happy and try to figure out, okay, well, we sort of, I think we could apply for this one. I think we can fit into this grant proposal. I think we can twist this so that our extended day is kind of like after school, and trying to fit into what funders think groups need. And I think that it's really important that when we look at test scores, we look at data, and we're asking for that stuff, that we try to really hear what the organizations are saying that they need. So when you look at sort of the climate in Washington, D.C., and we're talking about pay for performance, our pay for performance at KIP, our problems are not the same problems DCPS has. So the workforce at DCPS, Michelle Rhee needs to create a system very different than what KIP needs to create. But we also need help with pay for performance. We need funding too to stay competitive and work with Michelle and side by side with DC Public Schools. So I really would encourage us to look at the data, use it as a starting point, but then really go to the organizations and the individual. What's going on in Denver is very different than what's going to happen in DC. And in sort of in the KIP world, what's going on in Houston KIP is very different than what's going on in DC KIP. And so, I sort of put the responsibility back on the funders and the philanthropists to say, hey, we need to talk to these organizations. They probably do know exactly what they need help with. And that's where I would really encourage, how we leverage data is to get in there, dig deeper, and then hear the organizations, their leadership can tell you where exactly, we need help and support. And I would also just the training part and going back to ed schools and not having teachers getting trained well enough before they enter the workforce has been a real problem for us. And so we have figured out how to create, by looking at the medical profession as well, teacher residencies that we have just started, where even if you come out of ed school, you will probably spend a year in our residency program before you become teacher of record, because you probably are not prepared to teach in an urban environment the way that we need you to.
Josh McConnell in the queue.
Sure. So I think we've got Naomi, and then we'll turn back to you.
Thanks, Ross. Just a quick comment that in districts like Philadelphia and large urban systems where things are not simplified and aligned yet, it's very common where you have schools that have 15 different programs all at once. So you have layers and layers of programs. Some are federal, some are state, some are local funders, and there's just a lot going on. So when you ask the question about what might complicate the data or make it confounded and make it less clear what it all means, that might be one. Because while many of those programs do not penetrate the classroom, they're more like programs to support, special issues and, things like that. They do pull the teachers in some ways into different initiatives. Some may be just district-driven initiatives as well internally. So there's a lot kind of impacting what happens to kids, whether it infuses into the classroom or not.
Yeah, so there seems like there's two elements of that. One is just the proliferation of sort of programs and interventions and whether it's all coherent. And, just back to Susan's point about whether, if you're forced to sort of chase this program or that program and you try to figure out, well, can we make it work for what we need? But you end up with potentially a number of other things instead of sort of a focus. And then the added element of, and that they all likely have their own reporting requirements, and how do we start to think about using some more common understandings of what success looks like, so that we could use potentially fewer data collection protocols and processes for answering those questions. Someone on the phone, I'm not sure if it was Jim or somebody else wanted to jump in next.
Yeah, this is Jim. I agree with what you just said, Josh, and what Naomi was saying. It's the idea of a unified evaluation plan with some common metrics, so that investors in particular programs, which we're still going to need targeted intervention programs and probably more than one program in a school, but taking some of the compliance complexity out of this work by having measures that people agree are the standards for the field in terms of both the practice of teachers, effectiveness of teachers, and student learning, is going to be very helpful for both the schools and the program initiators understanding what the metrics are going to be when they go in, rather than having to conform to changing metrics over time and what the measures are that are going to matter. A couple lessons that we've learned just in terms of practical and getting folks to use data once it's available is that the more the data can be articulated in terms of thresholds of percentages of teachers hitting particular thresholds, or kids hitting particular thresholds of learning, so that you can actually put faces on the data, which is how many kids and which kids, or how many teachers and which teachers are struggling with X, Y, or Z in terms of effectiveness, is helpful more than is normative kind of data that researchers favor, which is the typical average or measures of efficiency, that we can try to get thresholds of how good is good enough, and then say how many of our teachers are hitting that, and teachers are they. The last thing was a point I tried to make earlier. I think this idea of expanding the measurement portfolio, as the Gates work is doing in defining teacher effectiveness, if we could start thinking about what kind of measures would we use to decide whether the data is being used effectively. So you've got great measures of what teachers know, and you've got great measures of what we're going to get down the road to what teachers are doing in classroom that's really good, and that should go full speed ahead. But sort of trailing right behind that needs to be, what are we going to look at in schools to see whether those data are used effectively? What kind of protocols could we use to look at when teachers are using data and having discussions about data? What's a good discussion? What's a action-focused discussion versus a diffuse discussion? And I know these are little soft areas, but these are areas where I think philanthropies could sort of start pushing now, because we're going to need that once we get these high-quality measures to assess the human side of this work.
Great. So I think we've got Todd, and then Kelly, and then Tony.
Oh, sorry.
Well, thanks. For about the past 10 years or so at Battelle for Kids, we've been helping practitioners use data.
So if somebody can mute, who's out there in the field. Thanks.
Well, one of the things we've been doing is really a lot of the conversation today has been focused around the right measures, and I think the work at the Gates Foundation is helping us to validate what are those right measures. And we've talked a lot about the use of data today and how we get data to people and have them start using it. What we've found in working with practitioners to use value-added data and other data elements over the years is that analysts and researchers do well with data and people do well with information. And so when we think about how we can put information with an authentic purpose in the hands of educators to inform their practice, then that is what we find when we find people actually start using information. So that's one of the first things. And I think that one of the things that concerns me, and I think some folks mentioned it earlier, is some business parallels. Many years ago, business started investing in data warehousing. And we're seeing a lot of that investment occurring in the technical aspects or technical challenges of schools and data systems today. But it's more the adaptive challenge of how to use that information. And what we saw in business was the data warehouse alone was not the solution. It was the business intelligence solutions that came out of being empowered by those data warehouses. So let's not overlook the power of educational intelligence and making sure we harness those data warehouses with information that people can act on and that people can respond to. And if we stop at the technical system, then we're not going to overcome that adaptive barrier to using information for improvement.
Great. It's very helpful. Kelly?
I just wanted to add another piece of useful data to the conversation, which I think is college acceptance and college completion. So in the state of California, only 60-some students graduate from high school, and only 30% of those graduates actually are eligible to apply to a four-year school, so our state and our UC system in California. So I think to push on school leaders again, and they're going to have to make some difficult decisions around school design, if you look at schools that are tracking still and you look at AP and honors classes, you can predict which kids will be in those classes, and it's often the socioeconomic status and the education level of the parents. So I feel like if we continue with those practices, it's discriminatory as far as providing opportunities for all students. So I think looking at how to, even though it's more difficult pedagogically, how to move towards mixed ability classrooms and graduation requirements that either meet or exceed whatever the state requirements are to even apply to a four-year school. So at High Tech High, 99% of the kids go on to college, 70% four-year schools, and of all of the students, 40% are in the first in their family to go to college. So I think it's possible, but I think it's not just about what teachers do in their classroom and about their test scores, but also about the way that school design is approached and expectations around graduation requirements.
Thanks. Tony?
One of the things that's really struck me about the discussion has been the fact that we early went to the issue of culture versus measurement. And a lot of the comments that we've heard suggest that culture is important, or maybe even way more important than measurement. And I think that there's some truth to that. And our colleagues in the private sector in industrial psychology have found that, and that's been the trend in that field for quite some time, to see that the implementation of the system and the feedback and the use is actually more important than the actual instrumentation. That being said, I think there are a couple instrumentation areas that philanthropists and others can help us with. And I think there are primarily two of those. One is the fact that, as my colleague here to the left has said, existing systems do a fairly good job of telling us who's maybe up to a proficient level and how bad teachers are worse than okay teachers. What we don't know a lot about is what makes the really good high value added teachers, for example, really good teachers. There needs to be a lot more work on actually getting into what are those specifics beyond the threshold competencies really make a great teacher great. And part of that's going to be content knowledge and the content specific pedagogy, and that's areas where people are working, but I think there's a lot more work to be done there. To my right here are folks who've been looking at that issue in terms of what sort of makes a really high value added teacher a high value added teacher. So there has been some research on that, but I think there's a lot more that can be done to try to extend the top of the measurement. We all know that some of the standardized tests have thresholds that prevent really smart or really well-prepared students from showing everything they know. I think similarly, a lot of our evaluation systems aren't good enough to tell us what the differences between a sort of proficient teacher and a really exceptional teacher is, and we need to work a little more on that.
So I think that's a great transition into actually what's going to end up being our sort of last section of the meeting, which is trying to talk about, so what are, you know, in the agenda, it talks about what are the hedge bets. I mean, what are the areas that are sort of underinvested in right now, or where we would make suggestions about what would help in the transition or the building of knowledge that's potentially underattended to now? And also on the flip side of that, if there are things that actually seem like they've gone particularly well in education, grant making, or the progress that's been made in education reform, are there any lessons that we can bubble up that we ought to make sure get more attention or more uptake? So Hella, and then we've got, I think, comments here and here.
I think what would be really useful for us at DCPS is knowing more about what good professional development is, because we want to use impact to help teachers get better at what they do. And we're putting together some resources for them, but the truth is we don't really know how good those resources are, and we don't have a systematic way of making that decision for ourselves.
Thanks. Todd, did you want to keep it over there, and then we'll... Sure, Paul.
Sure. I think just a couple of thoughts that we've been having as an organization as we've been pulled into a consultative role to help districts kind of navigate how to use value-added data in the context of evaluation and a lot of these things. And I think I'd just like to leave you with thinking about the balance between evaluation instruments for improvement and evaluation instruments for judgment. And we have to make sure that there is a tension there, and we have to make sure that we balance that tension. It doesn't necessarily need eliminated, but we need to look at balancing that. And one of the things I recommend to people when they first start going down this path is to look at a kind of a provocative book by Steve Colbert, and it talks about eliminating the performance review. And it talks about why you should eliminate the performance review in the context of a continuous improvement culture. And I'm not suggesting that we eliminate the performance review or the evaluation, but I am suggesting that look at some of his claims in a way to say, is what we're doing going to help? And if we think of that as a provocative book or themes to make sure it helps guide us to where we're developing evaluation systems for improvement and not judgment alone, that's important.
And curious, let me just probe on that for a minute. If you have any reflections from the work that you have done with the districts on ways in which potentially they've started down the path of judgment and have recognized that it hasn't given them information that they might need, or has put in place things that make it harder on the improvement side. I'm just curious if there's anything that illustrates that.
You know, I think we're a little early in that space to really tell you that. I think the recognition of having a few people, and oftentimes it's the union representation or association representation that will stop people to think about, now, are you going to use this information to put in the hands of a principal so they can get you? And so I think that's one of the big pushbacks. And when we recognize that, what are we going to do with the power of information? And I think that's one of the things that we try to counsel people on, is to think about how to harness that for improvement and make sure that those supports are in place. We ask one simple question when we produce data, or we're asking people to analyze data, and that is, what is your response to the data? And if you just simply ask that every time, it's a really good way to get to improvement.
Great. So Paul, and then Steve, and then Cindy.
Well, I found this to be an incredibly rich and informative discussion today, and learned a lot from a really knowledgeable audience. And so I thought I would just want to tackle very quickly this question about the hedge. For the last 2 years at Learning Point, my work has been to go from compliance, leadership, and innovation. And I think that we hear a lot about innovation in education, but we really don't do much about authentic innovation. And I think building on what Todd has said, the body of knowledge that is out there can lead to innovation. One of the things that I wrote about, that I deal with the educators in every audience, is that one of the great innovations of all time we all use every day, and it coupled old bits of knowledge and that's a suitcase with wheels. And it's been around, and they're discovering in some cancer research now, looking at old knowledge and coupling these pieces together. We don't have innovation centers such as like a Procter & Gamble, Clay Street, where we pull educators and people with different perspectives together for 2 weeks to really reflect on the practice, to try to find ideas that might really work to address these questions that need the data. And so if I'm looking at funders, I'm thinking, I'm not saying pour a lot of money into projects that will lead to nowhere, but to certainly try to create the foundation to stimulate innovative thinking and education that aligns with the kinds of things that have been done in business that educators really can't afford to do. They can't go to the IDEOs and the Doblin Consultings of the world, but they can create centers with trained people to help bring practitioners together to focus on these ideas to see if they can bring about bold, new, dynamic thinking.
Josh, can I get in the queue? This is Ray Bouchard from Stanford.
Yep. So we've got a couple of people who are lined up, and then we'll turn to you. Actually, Steve, why don't you go next?
Great, happy to. Does pushing that button do anything? No. So we've talked a lot about evaluation and professional development as if these are entirely separate processes, and I think that might be part of the problem, is that we need to blur the distinction between the two a little bit. And in fact, I think that what undermines evaluation oftentimes is what undermines professional development. And what gets in the way of measures, we've been talking about measures and then use and professional growth as if they're separable as well. But you think about why evaluations aren't being used right now, and in part it's because teachers don't believe them. They think that rating is wildly inconsistent, that they're worried that, if their rating is dependent on the person who walks in the door, then it's an unfair system. And they're right. And if I were sitting across the bargaining table, if I were in Brad's former shoes, I wouldn't let him use the evaluation that they had when I was teaching in LA Unified either. I mean, they had 20 items on this checklist, and evidence is good hygiene was somewhere in the middle. That doesn't have face validity, which is the second problem. So even though I'm talking in psychometric terms, this is strongly related to professional judgment. Our measures need to reflect good professional judgment. When you have an instrument that doesn't have face validity and isn't getting to the heart of what I think constitutes effective practice as a teacher, or can't be shown, because I think new learnings can happen, as Steve Glazerman was talking about earlier. I think we can be convinced that the world is different than we see it. But let's not start with tools that are vastly separate from our experience, or reflect our experience in such wooden ways as to be dismissed out of hand. So that's what I fear. I think these things come together more than we're given credit.
Great. Ray, do you want to jump in, and then we'll turn to you?
Sure, thank you. This has been a tremendously rich conversation. I'm actually patting myself on the back that I actually was able to keep quiet for 2 hours without hedging in. But I wanted to just quickly sort of put some chips down on where I would want to make some investments. And I must say that I was nodding my head most of those 2 hours. I think much of what was discussed was I fully agree with. Now, with respect to issues around the digital capture, not only of classroom observations, but multiple measures and student artifacts, I would want to be able to make that investment, what I think could be critically exciting, especially given that we have all of the local control issues, the differentiation, district variation that has been already discussed. If we had a process whereby upload teacher evaluation information or establish provisions where there would be outside review of evaluative criteria through independent evaluations of teacher or school practice, sort of almost as a certification kind of process. I think that could terrific benefits in a number of ways. It creates a transparency in the evaluation process and some independence of review that really certifies local results. I think the work, and I'm part of the work with the Gates Foundation, that's what I find exciting, the opportunity for that kind of extension. The other part is if you have a platform of teacher and student artifacts, you can actually inquire using other frameworks. So one could use the work that comes out of the net. They could use work that is coming out of campus shop and others that have demonstrated reliability and validity around their measures of teaching, and look at those artifacts through their lens, which could be a very powerful learning tool. And then if I would, in one other piece, if I could just use one other metaphor around, not metaphor, but one more analogy, how do you get teachers, and I think this was talked about with respect to common language, how do you get teachers across the country in all these different arenas to sort of create a common language around teaching and learning and sort of mutually through networks work on problems in practice? What I would put forward here is National Writing Project. What if we had a national teacher project where, in fact, teachers, like the National Writing Project, were specifically trained around issues of assessment and inquiry and appraisal of teaching and learning, that there was a formal process in which they actually worked collaboratively within their own affiliated networks across the country around this issue of teaching and learning. I think there could be that coupled with the opportunity of having a digital platform which gives you source materials to do that work could be terrifically exciting. In all 50 states, they have hundreds of teachers that work on problems of practice around writing, and one could imagine if we wanted to create a national dialogue around effective teaching and learning and what it could look like, that may be a possibility. So those would be two areas where I would want to put some strategic investment.
That's great. Those were very helpful suggestions, Ray. Thank you. Cindy, I think you're actually going to get the last comment on the table, and then I'll very briefly, and hopefully Jane will wrap us up.
Okay, so I want to introduce another thought for investment. This is a very exciting time in education reform, particularly around evaluation. The progress we've seen in the last 6 months or a year is phenomenal. But I'm struck by Jerry Weist's comments about you can't put evaluation systems in place in dysfunctional organizations with dysfunctional structure. And slowly but surely, we're lurching forward in this country to having greater state domination in how we operate and manage our public school system. Right now, we're the most, as you all know, the most decentralized of any advanced country. But the states are not prepared for, they do not operate in a functional way. I'm not sure any state education agency does. And yet, with common standards, common assessments, we are giving them more responsibility. But nobody studies what kind of structure would make sense to move forward the agenda we all care about and have been talking about, what the structure at the state level should look like. We've had some good work around district structure, support schools and teachers. We have some interesting new studies around charter management organizations and some of the challenges they face and case studies of the leading ones. There is nothing on state education agencies, and there never has been. And well, we've taken on other depressing topics like evaluation, and we're going to dip our toe into it a little, but not do nearly an adequate job. And I just think we've got to start paying attention to that, because it is the future of our. It's going to be a key in our governance structure of public education as we go forward, and got to pay attention to it.
Great. Well, that's a sobering but a helpful suggestion. And Brad has asked if he makes it brief, can he make one more comment? So I thought everybody would be interested enough in if Brad can be brief. It was worth going there. So.
Labor relations. All of this mocks nix unless we're able to work it out, both in the state and the local labor context.
I appreciate Brad letting me give him a hard time. I don't know what I'm going to have to pay for it in the next invitation. I just want to thank everybody. Thank Jane and Josh and Cara and the team for putting this together, and thank everybody for how engaged you stayed, how actively you participated. I thought it was actually a very hopeful and thought-provoking conversation. Lots to think about. I think lots of good ideas were generated. And so I hope you were able to take something from it, and I know we certainly did. And so I just say thanks to everybody.
And I want to add a word of thanks, and thanks to Ross for helping to make this happen and for managing the process today so brilliantly. This was stunningly interesting for me. I was here I was here in the morning, but then had to conduct an interview at noon, and so I had you playing in the background. So I listened to you. I probably did a really bad interview because I was really listening to you. I just want to sort of say a word about where this goes from here. Our immediate audience for distilling what you've told us and conveying it to them are these foundation CEOs of large foundations, but our ultimate audience will be mostly principals of family foundations and much more the long tail of philanthropy that is doing an extraordinary amount of spending in the education sphere, but doesn't have access necessarily to the knowledge that you bring to the table and that they need to have in order to be in any kind of sensible partnership with those doing the real work. So I'm extremely grateful to you for giving a whole day to this process, and promise you we will do our best to faithfully relay this. But we may have to come back to you a lot from time to time to help us in our work with family philanthropists. So again, just thank you so much. This has really been enriching, and I'm glad I ruined the interview so I could listen to you. So you're really, but Ross, thank you. So to everybody.